Hi, so this is just a little preface to this long conversation I'm having with my friend Steven. I was thinking, should I divide it into smaller parts or do sound bites or things like this? But no, I think there is a demographic. There is certain people who will value getting information this way. I personally know I valued getting information this way. I got to the point where I was like, okay, I need so much of this information that if something isn't even more than 10 minutes, I'm not even going to check it out. And I would get things that were hour, 2 hours long, put that in two times speed, and just listen to them. And I still do that. But this is a good conversation I think I had with my friend Steven about this topic, the 1619 project. There are people who might look at these things and say, oh, who are these people to actually speak about this? Why should I care? No, but we're just talking about the content. I want to get beyond that aspect of having these preconceptions about who's allowed to speak about what not, and oh, you have to be ABC to speak about XYZ. No, let's just have the content exist on its own. Where if this was just something you were reading in a book, you didn't know anything about the two of us, how much would that change what we're saying? But despite that, we are who we are. And that may inform certain people into why we're speaking about, or they might take us more seriously or less seriously based on the different things. But anyway, I appreciate you if you do appreciate this content. If you do decide to watch this, as I mentioned, you can put it on two times speed, one times 1.5 speed, or make it faster, make it slower if you want. You can pause it and come back to the parts later. There will be at least one more part of this series because what we wanted to actually discuss in what we had mentioned before, we need to actually get into that as we're doing more of a deep dive into the actual content of the 1619 project from the website itself, from the New York Times website, where that's the main portal to get to this content. So, without further ado, let's get into that. I appreciate you taking your time. Like, share, subscribe. I will be creating an independent site where it'll be a single portal where people can get the different information, and maybe I can also provide a platform for you out there who might want to contribute to this conversation and just this human story, this story of humanity that is unfolding here. Okay, into the video, and I make some more sense when we're actually having the conversation. Into that now. Hello, this is Silas here, and I'm here with my friend. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Steven. Hello, everyone.
So we've done a few talks, and there's some different things we're talking about, and different things going on in the world. Some of our talks are more towards food. You are what you consume series, and this is, I think, kind of, sort of, not kind of related, but I guess it's more what your body politic consumes. And there's been things going on in the world that we have interest in, as you've seen in our conversations. So we're going to be talking about the 1619 project. Is that what it's called?
Correct.
Okay. So the 1619 project is something from the New York Times, and just give a quick overview of what you think it is. Then I'm going to actually read directly from the New York Times magazine about it, and then we're going to go to Wikipedia and have just a discussion about some of the criticisms, because there's, as they say, I think when you talk about this kind of topics, there are things we need to talk about. We need to have a conversation about these things and whatnot. Okay, so yeah.
So
What
I'm
did
going
you first hear
to,
about? Sorry.
I'm going to try to present it in the most charitable way, of course. Then we'll get into some of the criticisms. The reason they picked the year 1619 as project, well, they picked 1619 project as a name is because 1619 was the first year that a slave came to America, and this is supposed to be sort of a re-examination. I mean, they used to call it revisionist history, but that term kind of has ugly connotations now because revisionist originally meant just going back, looking through again to see if anything was missed. Whereas today people hear revisionist and they think, oh, you're rewriting history. But it's supposed to basically be doing that, but with slavery, and they're making the argument that when the first slaves came here, that was when America, as we know it, started, and then that, of course, led to future events, such as the founding of the country. It had lasting effects on the economy today, et cetera, et cetera. And it's basically, they would say, I guess it's a retelling of history, where slavery is front and center in all American history. It's what started the country, it's what the country was founded on, it was the driving force behind the economy, and it still persists to this day. And this was done by the New York Times. It was a few people. Nicole Hannah-Jones was one of the main ones. There are a few others too. I don't remember all their names, but I would point out that. What's that?
We'll probably get into that when we go
Yeah.
over the actual details of it.
And it was sort of a team of sociologists, journalists, a few other different characters, and this was awarded a Pulitzer. I'm trying to think if it was a year or two ago. And the Pulitzer, though, I should point out, it was more about the literary style. It wasn't about historical accuracy, which, of course, we'll get into.
Yeah, there is something, and you might be saying like, why are these two people talking about this? Like, I'm not an American. I have lived in the United States of America. I've had some concerns with it. I've had issues with just the whole talk, like Stephen mentioned, about America is still the most racist country, or if not the most, or one of the worst places to be in, and things like that. When I was living there, I was being told certain things by the messaging versus what my lived experience actually was.
Yeah.
Then now living in Kenya and looking to move back to the United States of America, being in and out over the last couple of years and things like that, and just getting more politically involved and looking into history, there are certain questions that I had just by hearing about the basics of what the 1619 Project was. It's like, this doesn't sound like it's going to be quite accurate. And from the things that I've heard about it, it's been suspect. But for me, with information, I don't think it matters. I don't have to say as a this or Stephen as a that. Stephen, as a person who's read the actual document, to me is somebody that I can listen to and have some input on, like, okay, what do you think about this? I am asking him what he thinks about this and what other people have said about it. And I'm just going to give some conversation and some ideas about that. It doesn't matter where we're from. This should be something where an alien could come down and read and listen to the information, and then they could break it down and somehow use critical thinking to discuss the actual topics of the information that they had. We're not saying anything is 100% like this. We're giving you our thoughts based on something, and I think that is valid enough. And
also, I was going to add, too, regardless of education level or anything, because as we'll get into, they're talking about introducing this in school curriculum, and one of my concerns, which I'm going to get into, is that if this has errors in it, they're teaching it and they're not teaching the other side. And I mean, and of course, I know this from personal experience. You're taught everything in school. You're taught all the pro-government angle, but you're not taught about. I mean, they touch on inventors and entrepreneurs a little bit, but like, for example, somebody like Rockefeller, they paint him pretty much entirely in a negative light. It's, here was this robber baron who exploited people. Thankfully, the government broke him up, but they don't get into things like, the price of kerosene kept falling. He was good to work for. He shipped oil in efficient ways that saved the railroads money, so he got rebates. Like, they don't get into that whole angle of it. It's very one-sided. And my concern is if stuff like this is taught to kids, especially at a young age, they have that completely one-sided view, and they don't hear the bigger picture. They just hear the agenda-driven one-sided. And an area I've sort of changed on this a little bit is I used to complain about bias, and like, I try not to do that anymore because we're all biased. I mean, I'm biased too, of course. But the point is, either way, people should be exposed to different sides of the argument. It shouldn't just be, okay, this is the truth, period. Don't question it. I mean, you're just creating a new religion at that point.
Yeah, I'll add to that, where I think what I like doing, what I enjoy from speaking with Stephen, I think something we agree on, is just adding more information to the market of ideas out there.
Yeah, of course.
We need to have a point where these are things that can be talked about. So I'm glad the 1619 Project was created. I'm even glad they won the Pulitzer, and I'm at the Pulitzer site. It was 2020 winner in commentary, and that was one of the things. Part of the reason that led to this, the most proximate reason that we're having this conversation is somebody accused Stephen of somehow being an apologist for the slavery that the founders of the United States of America had, and the rapes that I was like, when has he ever done that? So just show me the actual evidence.
What I also don't understand about this, you might have remembered I said this around the 4th of July, how people always say things like, the founders owned slaves, we stole Native American land. I'm like, I know, I learned this when I was a child, and I hear it over and over all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, this isn't some brand new breaking insight.
That's one thing I'm curious about with the United States of America, from looking at it from somewhat on the outside, or at least from having been able to actually leave the location. I think that gives some perspective to that, where it seems that people say the racial tensions are a lot higher now than in the history when I was just learning the basic history, when we all understand there was times just in living memory when segregation was outright there, where it's like you literally could not have a situation where me and Stephen could be in the same restaurant eating.
Yeah.
That was literally there. Right now, that isn't the case. Yet somehow, some people are claiming that America is becoming more racist. And there's just some issues where, like Stephen said, the information that he's had about whoever denied that actually happened. When has that happened? That we were like, yeah, that they never owned slaves. Like, isn't there aren't there famous people who are literally famous descendants from slave owners that Jefferson or something had? Like, he's actually accepted some of his family members to actually get some of his inheritance and things like that. I mean,
I gotta find it for you, but I saw a video on YouTube a while back where there was this kid, he's clearly mixed, and he said, Thomas Jefferson was my great whatever grandfather, and the teacher, I guess, in school was like, shut up, don't spread lies, but it turned out he actually was. And he and his family, they actually took pictures with Jefferson's white descendants, and it's like, these are all the living descendants of Thomas Jefferson. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely complicated. I definitely do appreciate getting more information in. But one thing I do kind of object to is, as you mentioned, the people who take this kind of content and say, first of all, you can't speak out against this without being 100% pro certain evil things in the world, or the pretense or the claim that this has been some hidden history. If maybe, but let's actually get into it right now. Let me just. It's a bit frustrating.
Yeah.
You can tell. So let me just read. You mentioned the Pulitzer Prize thing, and as a thing, like that conversation, somebody accused him of that, and then he kind of talked about. It's like, yeah, this is the person who accused him of that thing also did the whole appeal to. Isn't appeal to authority? What logical?
What was the statement?
What logical fallacy was it when he said, like, oh, they won a Pulitzer, so because they somehow won a Pulitzer, that supposedly means it's beyond. You can't criticize it anymore because they won the Pulitzer. I don't know why they mentioned that.
That's a form of the appeal to authority, because if you're appealing to a credential of some kind, and I'm not going to go on a tangent, but I've been also reading David Kelly's The Art of Reasoning. That's a book about logic. If you know who David Kelly is, he founded the Atlas Society.
I'm aware of the Atlas Society.
He founded that, yeah. So anyway, he talks about that. There's a very good section where he breaks down the appeal to authority, and he basically says, credentials obviously are not meaningless. I mean, you need a medical operation, you go to a doctor with the relevant knowledge. However, that doesn't mean you place blind faith in someone with credentials either. I mean, as we're going to see here, there are people with PhDs who take 5 different sides on economic issues. I mean, Chicago economists disagree with Austrian economists, they're both free market. Then you have classical Marxist economists who, of course, way disagree. And then, you have, I guess, more of the postmodern crowd. And it's just, it's like there's all these divisions, but these people all have PhDs and studied under other people. I mean, David Kelly, who I just mentioned, was mentored by Richard Rorty, who was a postmodernist, which is crazy because, a postmodernist who also was one of Cornell West's teachers, he actually taught David Kelly, who ends up becoming an objectivist, which is, of course, all about objective truth, objective reality, and all that. So, but I mean, they both earned PhDs from Princeton. It's like, would you say one is smarter than the other? No, you have to break it down. What is each one saying? Who makes the stronger case? And the criticism with the Pulitzer would be, it's awarded for prose and writing style, not historical accuracy. And I have to look it up, and I think they actually said it. They said this was awarded for the writing style and storytelling. That's
a good transition to reading it here. This is the 2020 Pulitzer Prize winner in commentary. They even say it's in commentary. For distinguished commentary using any available journalistic tool, $15,000. This is Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times for a sweeping, provocative, and personal essay for the groundbreaking 1619 Project, which seeks to place the enslavement of Africans at the center of America's story, promoting public conversation about the nation's founding and evolution. So the winning work is listed here. Our democracy's founding ideas are false when they were written, Black Americans have fought to make them true. And the biography of Nicole Hannah-Jones here is a domestic correspondent from the New York Times magazine focusing on racial injustice. She's the creator of the 1619 Project, a groundbreaking look at the impact of slavery 400 years after the first slaves arrived in what would become the United States. She has written on federal failures to enforce the Fair Housing Act, the resegregation of American schools, and policing in America. Her extensive print and radio reporting on the way segregation in housing and schools is maintained through official action and policy has earned a National Magazine Award, a Peabody Award, and a Polk Award. She was also named to the 2017 MacArthur Fellow. Ms. Hannah Jones earned a Bachelor in History and African American Studies from the University of Notre Dame, a Master's in Journalism, and a Mass Communication from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Miss Hannah Jones lives in Brooklyn with her husband and very sassy daughter. Sassy, that seems like it's a bit of of a trope, because Miss Hannah Jones, if you haven't actually been able to tell from this what was mentioned here, is a person of color. I guess you would consider herself that. So that whole sassy thing, is that the sassy black woman thing? Is that what they're talking about? It's come on, Pulitzer, you could do better. It's current year. So yeah, that's what they have to say about her there. Anything to any thoughts on that? Like as you mentioned, as we in that conversation, you told that person it's about commentary. It's not. So this person bringing this up about historical accuracy, it's commentary. Just like we're giving commentary, and you could look at what we're saying and be like, oh no, that's not right. Some of the stuff they said here might not be right.
Well, but that's the thing too, because that's a phrasing that keeps coming up now. People say it's history, but it's his story. It's written from a different perspective, so it leaves out certain things. And that's sort of a postmodern critique of, and I guess critical theory. I would have to look exactly which it would be, but sort of a critique of traditional history as we're told it. And to be fair, there is a grain of truth to it. It's important to hear things from different perspectives. Yes. The problem is when you start omitting things that go against your narrative, and you cherry pick things that just fit your narrative. And like you say, if we're told, oh, you're not supposed to question this, well, I mean, are you really about educating people and seeing the bigger picture, or are you just pushing an agenda? And that's one of the problems I have here.
Because one thing that raises a question mark to me is, like, Black Americans have fought to make them true. So when they make a statement like that, which founding ideas were false? The idea can exist and be true, but the way you actually act on it could be not true to the idea. Yeah. So the language being used is dicey. Words don't necessarily mean what you always think they mean. That's part of why you have conversations.
We'll get into that too.
Yeah, words are descriptors of things, and as you mentioned, it's his story. So what is her story? What is the story of the 1619 Project? And I'm going to go now another reading, if you don't mind. This is directly from the New York Times Magazine at the 1619 Project. So here, I would say this is, before we read the Wikipedia, this is something that is decisive. This is something, the people who made this is what they actually are putting on their front page as their main page to say what this project is. Right. So here we go. So the New York Times Magazine, the 1619 Project. It starts off with the ocean. Black and white ocean. In August of 1619, a ship appeared on this horizon near Point Comfort, a coastal port in the English colony of Virginia. It carried more than 20 enslaved Africans, who were sold to the colonists. No aspect of the country that would be formed here has been untouched by the years of slavery that followed. On the 400th anniversary of this fateful moment, it is finally time to tell our story truthfully. Thoughts on that intro?
I mean, again, it's in fairness to them, it's well written. It's provocative, but I mean, you can see the angle they're coming from, and some of what they're saying is true. Obviously, the slaves coming in, but again, the stuff which we're going to get into it's a lot of bad methodology. It cherry picks. It omits other things. They start, you talk about the importance of definitions. They start conflating all these things that don't go together. Again, when we get into specific topics, I'll say what I'm referring to.
Okay.
But yeah.
So, with my thoughts on this, with some of my bias from my background to this, some of the things that might inform, even the way they use things, my life experience informs the way, and I do get that. The things they say are not necessarily wrong. What I normally have questions with is the conclusions and the statements and the prescriptions they come to after saying and doing certain things. Or I'm like, how do you get from there to here? Yeah. Because when I was interested with what was going on, you just heard people say the slave trade from Africa. So Africa is a massive place.
Yeah.
It's a massive, huge place. So I would think, did my ancestors, because my ancestors were here, like I was talking to my parents about this and tracking how far back, like their actual, like they can track back their ancestors living in the village area that they have. Just had some interesting stories about that. Might do a separate conversation, but anyway. So it's not that you know there, but they're there. So I know they're not like out. They weren't slaves. I'm not a descendant of slaves from all I knew in the United States of America. But I thought, did my ancestors capture any people, any tribes people in Africa at that time, and then sell them to the slave traders? And could I be part of a history of people that enslaved people who are now Americans? And I looked, and it turned out that no, actually, that was not involved, because the transatlantic slave trade was transatlantic. That was a long time before globalization. That was a long time before technology. Even right now in Africa, the travel around Africa without using planes is still suspect. Not just because it's size, just the development.
Right.
But you weren't having people taken from East Africa to the West Coast and then to be shipped off. It's a few countries on the West Coast of Africa that made up about 95% of the actual people that were taken in the transatlantic slave trade over that time. So even just this general thing of Africans is so general. It's such a general term. Yet,
Well,
so for me,
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, let me just finish up. So for me, I found out at that time about the trans-Saharan slave trade, and that was from people in the Middle East taking people from the Horn of Africa area, from the Eastern Africa area, and mostly walking them across the Sahara Desert into the Middle East. And the death rate for that one was a lot higher. There's no actual even minority to speak of African, like of Negro descent in the Middle East, because a lot of them were castrated. A lot of the women, when they had kids, the kids were just killed. And this is information that's not necessarily told. So for me, as you've seen with this evocative open, I noticed why is it that the slave trade from the United States of America seems to burn so much brightly in horror than anything else? And it's because they snitch on themselves. They make things like this. They have the freedom of speech for people to talk about things like this. They have the willingness to discuss these things and put them out in society and make shows like The Roots, make books about these things, have the actual conversations about this. Try to do this. Try to have an independent newspaper in Saudi Arabia and do a 1619 Project equivalent of the trans-Saharan slave trade and see how that will be received.
Yeah,
So it's not going to happen.
You'd be shot. Yeah.
It's to me, it's kind of a question to have. So what were you going to say? Sorry.
So, well, there were a few points I was just going to sort of add on to that. Like, for example, I know Pelosi and company came under fire when they wore those kente cloths, because the kente were worn by the higher-ups in the Ashanti Empire, and the Ashanti Empire captured other Africans in West Africa, sold them to the Europeans. They traded them for guns, and they used those guns to conquer other people around them. And the point about Europeans working with local collaborators is very important, because what a lot of people forget is that way back when they said the lifespan of a European in Africa was under a year. Because if you think about it, malaria, you're in a foreign land, you don't have technology to identify where you are. You could be picked off by wild animals, by roaming tribes. You could be, all these things could happen to you. So
eating something you're allergic to. There's so many things.
You had to work with people there. So there was, there were tribes that were willing to say, hey, we'll give you these people we captured, in turn give us guns or other things. I think the Portuguese, they said, were the only ones who actually went in and captured people directly. All the other Europeans worked with local collaborators. So, again, obviously that's not saying that's not letting the Europeans off the hook, but at the same time, you can't let those people off the hook either. They're all complicit.
Yeah. Okay, so a little more reading from the New York Times. So this Nicole Hannah-Jones, she won this for a personal essay, which was one of 10 different essays.
Yeah.
So it wasn't even the entire 1619 project, was it, that won the Pulitzer?
No, I'm trying to think now. Yeah, because she wrote it in essay form, and then Phil Magnus's critique, which we'll get into, he wrote it in a similar way, like he tackled issue by issue. And he was originally writing it. I think they were being published, but then he decided to compile it into one book because just make it easier and have it all there.
Because here the quote is repeated again from the Pulitzer page. Our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written. Black Americans have fought to make them true. And it says essay by Nicole Hannah-Jones. But it's followed by another quote. If you want to understand the brutality of American capitalism, you have to start on the plantation. Essay by Matthew Desmond. So, you see, if you were talking about something, the 1619 Project, discussing it as a whole, and then that person refers to the Pulitzer, which was a Pulitzer awarded for conventory for 1 out of the 10. And this is something that the 10 people tend to do. They just bait and switch and switching things around. And then you see they're talking about the slavery thing. And then I guess, what is American capitalism? What does that mean?
Well, that's something too. We'll get into this more as the discussion goes on. But that was one of Magnus's points. He goes, they're using capitalism to just describe all sorts of things we don't like about the economy. Like they're talking about British mercantilism. I mean, for those that don't know, mercantilism, the government props up certain companies. The companies go out, create business. They give people in government a kickback. They call that capitalism. They talk about slavery. They call that capitalism. They talk about the late 19th century. That's capitalism. They talk about the economy today with all the government. It's just capitalism to them is just things I don't like about the economy. There's no clear definition. What is it and what is it not? It's just,
It's like they completely ignored the main aspect in it. It's capital. That's a key part of it. So what do some of these things have to do with capital itself? Okay, so
it gets crazier. It gets crazier too because I know, for example, they bring up double entry bookkeeping, which if you see your bank account checkings and savings, it's the thing side by side, and they try to say that was invented in the antebellum South, but no, that's been around at least since the Renaissance. Some say even before, and they're trying to compare it to Microsoft Excel today. And then there was another thing too. I have to look up exactly what she said, but she was comparing criticisms of Obamacare to slavery, and I was just like, what? It's just there's all these reaching things to try and conflate all these things they don't like.
Yeah, and this is my question to. All right, go ahead.
I was like, there's just so many fallacies in here. Non sequitur, poisoning the well. I mean,
And this is my question and request to anybody out there who might feel we're being unfair or think we're wrong on something. Just show us the evidence. I'll be willing to see, and I think you'll see that this has been critiqued. It's not just these capitalist, money-loving American people. It's across the board. Critiques have come in from various sources.
Well, that's something I always emphasize. I mean, Phil Magnus is a libertarian. People could say, oh, well, you disagree with him. Fine, okay. But I mean, those historians wrote in the letter to the New York Times. I know some of them are mainstream, sort of left-leaning, like James McPherson. The Jacobin and Socialist magazine has an article critiquing the King Cotton thing. And then I read one of our mutual friends posted the other day the one from that socialist website, and apparently there was one of the socialist thinkers even wrote a book critiquing this as well. So it's like it's being attacked from every angle, which, what does that tell you about credibility?
Yeah. Okay, so next part of the New York Times. For hundreds of years, enslaved people were bought and sold in America. Yes? Completely okay with that? That is fact.
Yeah.
Today, most of the sites of this trade are forgotten. That's probably also true.
Yeah.
But they're showing some places where there's actually some statues or some signifiers in the images. It's a photo essay by Bauman, and it's the text by Ansi Bailey. Now, something like this, as I mentioned before, I think there's definitely more places of where the slave trade was happening in the United States of America.
Yeah.
During the transatlantic slave trade than they would be in Brazil, than they would be in the Caribbean, where majority of the people who were taken on the transatlantic slave trade actually ended up in.
Yeah.
And for sure, there's a lot more where those people left. Like that location where you can actually go and you can say in 1619, this is where the first ship came from.
Yeah.
I would be shocked if you can actually find the location. Okay, I wouldn't be that shocked. I think I might actually be able to understand you find that location, but you're not going to find the port they left from because Ghana or Western African country where it was, they kept track of it. You would find it because the American or the British at this time, the British captain was the one keeping track of what port they left in. So if you were actually going to try to find some of these locations in Africa, it wouldn't be because the Africans have been keeping track of that. It's because the people who were dealing with them, like I say, it's the snitching. They snitched on themselves. They told on themselves. Okay, so are they forgotten? As I mentioned before, I don't think it's been forgotten. I think United States of America, and this is part of the exceptionalism of that culture, is a place that is exceptional in the sense that they're willing to talk about these things.
Yeah. And again, back to the point about the founders, that's why I don't get this, oh, people keep bringing up they own slaves. It's like, this isn't some new insight. I mean, I learned this very early on. It gets brought up repeatedly. Like, nobody's denying, the founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, the majority of them were slave owners. I mean, that's not some new, controversial take.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's just virtue signaling. I don't know if it's people want to show moral superiority. I mean, I don't know. It's not some brand new.
That is the thing that I.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I try to hesitate psychologizing always because, obviously I don't know everybody's saying that, but it seems weird that they keep asserting something that is so commonly known, like it's some brand new idea.
And that's the same thing. That's part of why I'm having this conversation, part of why I make these videos, is maybe somebody else can explain why it is. Are we the ones who are making the false assumption that people actually know about this? What do you consider a lot? When somebody makes a statement like our trade are forgotten, today most of these sites of this trade are forgotten. What do they mean most? I mean, I think most is what, 50% plus one? And technically, since there were so many of them and so many of them were made probably unofficial, then yes, I would say, something like in the past there was horse and buggy trade before the cars were invented.
Yeah.
They had some major stations where you'd actually go get horse and buggies. But most of the places where you'd get a horse and buggy or a horse and carriage have been forgotten.
Yeah.
Most of the places that were involved in the trade of buying horses and carriages have been forgotten. I can make that statement and be completely accurate, but because the ones that are still remembered had to be large at a certain situation. What does forgotten mean? It's
well, so one of our friends made that point about the Pantheon in Rome. There was probably some shack or hut or something there before. We don't know what was there. But they built a giant temple which commemorated all the gods, and then it became a church later. So, but it's like they could have demolished it and put a McDonald's or something there. But they decided at some point, okay, this is important enough. We're going to hold on to this long term. Yeah.
And related to that, most of the temples to Zeus and to Athena and to all those other gods, Zeus and Athena, is that the Romans or the Greek gods? I keep forgetting
those are Greek, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So most of their temples have also been forgotten. And those temples weren't about enslaving people. Those were still done. Those were things that they were completely proud of.
Yeah.
In general, we forget things in the past.
Yeah.
That's just what people do. Okay, so moving on to the next one. Myths about physical racial differences were used to justify slavery and are still believed by doctors today. Yeah, I think that's true. But then, as I mentioned, how many doctors?
But that also runs into conflicts too, because people have tried to say there's no biological differences between the race except for skin color. But then when you start delving into other things, people get defensive. And I think the core of it is it taps into a lot of people's deepest anxieties, which I understand where they come from. But if you're truly about science and getting to the truth has no bias, truth has no prejudice. It's just what does the data say? And again, I understand the arguments of, okay, they could get certain data and that could be weaponized by people. That's one of the criticisms of the book, The Bell Curve, is that people use that as justification. Oh, they're not as smart as us because this study says so. And I get that argument, but my argument would be we have to keep digging because there's sort of that joke about how people complain, oh, certain minority groups aren't represented in scientific studies, but then they also say, well, there's no difference biologically except skin color. It's like, well, doesn't really matter then. If it's just if skin color is the only difference, well, what is there to study? But if there's other differences, different groups should be studied. But that, it's just like it runs into contradictions when you try to.
And then again, this is something that I consider somewhat myopic and I don't want to say xenophobic. What's the term? Is there like a I guess xenophobic is normally like you dislike people from the outside, or xenofocused, xenophilic, or just self-centered in that
That's
sense,
about right.
where if you have a situation where you're saying something in the United States of America is keeping black people away from the sciences, what is keeping a country like Kenya from just establishing its own science division of people and just having a whole bunch of scientific discoveries coming out of Kenya?
Yeah.
I mean, the information is the information, right? I mean, we can still just have people invest in laboratories and in computers and all these things, but why doesn't that happen? Why don't you see that in a place like China? Do you think somehow that United States of America, that racism that you're saying exists there, has somehow seeped into China to the point where they are controlling what the Chinese are doing, to the point where China can't be making these amazing advancements on their own? Yeah, they just recently supposedly just sent a rocket that's supposed to land some
Mars,
supposed to
right?
land some rovers on Mars in
Yeah, I heard that.
like months from now, because it's just super far from here. So and then there's the whole amount of how much is actually being stolen and things. So what is the thing? When you focus so much on just what's happening in your neighborhood, in your backyard, like some of the NBA players would say, "Oh, I'm gonna focus on what's in my backyard. I don't care what's happening in Hong Kong." When they do that kind of thing, that kind of misses me. Because for me, once I start getting outside of things that affect me personally directly, it doesn't really end at my nation or my neighborhood. Once it's outside of me, it kind of just taps into like entire humanity. But people seem to have that point where it's like, okay, their self-identity, their smallest identity group is a tribe or is a location, and then the things outside don't really seem to affect what they think about that thing, if that makes any sense.
But I was gonna say these people contradict themselves there too, because they keep saying things about, especially with all your recent events. Oh, we need to listen to these people. We need to shut up and listen. We need to hear other perspectives. We need to think out of our own experience. But then you talk about the Uyghur Muslims in China, and it's well, that's far away. I don't care.
Yeah.
So yeah, that runs into contradictions too. And I think it's sort of the postmodern thing of it's more about power, and it's about you pick and choose these things when it's convenient for the narrative, and then dismiss at other times. It's like, you don't want to talk about women being treated horribly in the Middle East, because then you don't want to be labeled as a bigot who's criticizing Islam. So instead it's, a guy sitting with his legs open on the subway, that's a problem. And then it's,
Or just So there's many
there's a lot
questions and frustrations because they make this statement that myths about physical racial difference. So by that statement, they're technically not saying all physical racial differences are mythological. They're saying the myths about those.
Yeah.
And then they say to justify slavery. Yes, some have been used to justify slavery. Some myths, including the Bible, that Black Americans are predominantly, I think they have the biggest group that's self-identified Christian, and the Bible itself is okay with slavery. Exodus 21 and other places say, yes, you can have slaves. So that is also one of the myths that has been used to do that. But how much of that would they actually discuss? I'm okay with discussing these things, like the statement itself, but then why are they specific about certain parts, about the things they talk about in the certain ways? What is behind it? And that's what you're talking about with the whole, not trying to get into the psychology of people, or trying to say, but that's what we do. We try to understand each other in a sense. I'm not saying this is what they think, this is what they believe. I'm trying to understand why they would be saying and acting in the way that they do, saying the things that they say and acting the way that they act. That's part of what I'm trying to do here.
And James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian have that book about Impossible Conversations, and they talk a lot about this, about trying to understand where people are coming from, even if we disagree. And one of the things I like about James Lindsay is he can explain critical theory, neo-Marxism, all those different schools of thought. He can explain them very articulately, in some cases better than the people themselves. But that's why he's able to argue so well against them, because he knows, okay, I can steel man their arguments as best as I can, but here's where it fails. And, when they try to come after him, it's like, he'll encounter these 20-something-year-olds who think they know everything, then he'll know more than they do, and they're kind of bewildered, because it's, okay, this guy not only knows my arguments better than I do, but he also knows how to argue against them, so.
Okay, so that was a quote from the essay by Linda Villarosa. Let's move to the next quote. This is an essay by Jamal Bowie, or Bowie. It's like Bouie. I think it's Bouie. I think it's like the French thing. It's Bouie. It could be like a Creole type of name.
Oh, yeah.
America holds onto an undemocratic. Sorry, America. I'm getting thrown up with that whole. Before I was talking, I forget what it was. It was like we say "an" instead of "a." I forget what I was using it on. There was some word. I was like, wait, I've actually never. I can't remember when I wrote that word down. Where it's like you use "an" even though it's an "e" word. It's a euro. It's like the money of the country or the political group, the euro. We say a euro instead of an euro.
Yeah.
Even though it's EUR. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, it's a vowel
Okay.
sound.
So again, America holds onto an undemocratic assumption from its founding that some people deserve more power than others. Okay, so let's try and unpack this, but like deserve? First
Well,
of all,
I would just say, I mean, iron law of oligarchy. I mean, there's going to be hierarchies and everything.
yes.
You can't, they talk about worker co-ops and how many have worked well. I think they point to like 2 of them. As a manager, I can tell you, I had to write performance reviews, and it's like, it's debate. Obviously, it's not to antagonize anyone, but it's basically here's areas you need to improve, and if we can help you improve, how do we do it? But you can't have employees voting on, oh, we want to come in late now. Oh, we want to be able to do this. It's like, the place is going to fall apart. I mean, you need hierarchy to a degree. So there's, I get the angle of, okay, only white property owning men should vote. So, I think that's what I take it to mean. But at the same time, it's like, everybody can't have power. I mean, look, now what percentage of the population votes now? It's a fraction of it. And, how beholden are our politicians to the voters anyway? And then that gets into special interest. And I mean, that's a whole thing in of itself. But, how much power does the average person have now, and how much could they have? I mean, that's one of the flaws of a lot of these socialist revolutionary types is they think, oh, if I have my revolution, I'm going to be in charge. But everyone can't be in charge.
Yeah. And in general, with the democracy thing, aren't you voting for who has the power? Now,
Yeah.
you see, that's the question of they're not against the whole idea that certain people should have more power over certain things. I think here the key is deserve.
Yeah.
Why should, if you don't personally have enough ability and power, enough ability to have the power to decide what you do of your day-to-day life, why should you be given the power to decide on what third party decides to do with everybody else's life? So that whole universal suffrage thing to me seems nonsensical. And it is nonsensical to most people because most people live their life without asking for a universally selected group with no other thing besides an arbitrary thing if they happen to live in a certain location and be between a certain age group and haven't committed certain crimes to decide what they will do with their day-to-day life. Most people don't go through that process of just asking people to do that. So they understand that there are certain qualifications and interests for somebody to have a standing or an ability to make a valuable or worthwhile decision off of something before you actually go to say, let's hear this person. These are the same people that say, let's appeal to the authority of the Pulitzer Prize. They have the power to decide who is actually somebody valid to listen to. Let's listen to the authorities about X, Y, Z in our life. Oh, you have to wear this. You have to do that. You have to shut this up. You can't open this. These are the kind of people. Coming down to the point, I, as a black man, I'm the one who can speak on the black experience. So you're saying just by literally being born a descendant of slaves, that automatically makes you have more power to speak over certain topics than other people, even if that other person has studied that and has information on that. Is that what they're trying to say?
Well, it's sort of, I sort of coined this expression from you, but the whole thing about how intersectionality is Ebola, it kills off its host faster than it's spread. I've used that as a hashtag a few times, if you notice, because, again, I'm going to steel man it as best I can. I understand where intersectionality came from. Okay, different tiers of oppression, experience of a black man is going to be different from a black woman because there's racism and sexism. A white woman's experience is going to be different from a black man. I get where all that came from, no question. But the problem is it becomes this thing that they dogmatically apply to everything, where it completely leaves out individuals and circumstances, and then you've got, oh well, we can't make it as I as a black woman can't make a decision here because this is a black trans woman. They're more oppressed than me, so they should have a say.
Yeah.
And then it just gets to a point where, where is it going to end? It's going to be a disabled minority trans person making all the decisions, and then it's like if you keep reducing it to all those categories.
You see, and this is something that I think in a recent conversation we had, I was trying to think, does this come down to a sense of individualism where you're going to eventually break down the groupings to the point where the individual is the most important thing because everybody would be individually unique in their own particular way, and they might come around to that, come to individualism moment. But that's something I've been hoping for a while, but I don't think that's the case because they're not necessarily saying, from my experience as this, I should talk about this. It seems like when they identify those things, when they identify those classifications, they seem to be they seem to be describing themselves off of the description they have of the larger group, rather than saying their individual experience as this thing has informed them. If that makes sense. So that's something that kind of frustrated me, but in the same way, I think it's good to see, because I think that's more accurate to what's going on. It's not me saying, oh, I broke my leg and this is what I experienced from directly breaking my leg. It's more like, as somebody that has broken their leg, you need to actually treat me like your definition of what all these people who've broken their legs are. And that to me is like the creepy, the weird mutated aspect of it.
Yeah, because I remember and again, it runs in other contradictions too, because I remember talking to someone about my grandfather and his successful business career, and this person was like, oh, well, your grandfather got where he was because he was white. And it's like, okay, first off, it was him and a bunch of other white guys, so it's not like that was a deciding factor. And also, I mean, he wasn't from a prestigious or connected family, so he had to actually work his way up. So it's like, now it is true that he had opportunities that, black people in this country didn't have. That part I agree with 100%. But if you're going to look at him and say, oh, he got where he is solely because he's white, and this is kind of what I was getting at, where I understand where the philosophy is coming from, but the problem is it becomes this dogmatic thing that gets applied to everything, where they just ignore individual circumstances, they ignore other variables, and they try to impose it on reality rather than taking reality as it comes. I guess I could put it that way.
Now I'm wondering, is like, as I mentioned, hopefully this is just kind of trying to understand new things, getting new information, as we've both discussed, and we both think the system that most people have been put through to get information hasn't been that good. I'm not even saying like with the unintentional indoctrination in schools and things like this, just the sheer limitations of access to information that we've had. As I mentioned, in Africa, they didn't keep track of the actual effect of the slave trade that was going on. They just weren't tracking those things. And I think by them not having the awareness to see this is what's happening. These families were taken away from this location to that location. These are the kind of resources that were transferred. They're bound to repeat those things again and not take account of the actual negative effects of these things or be able to track some of these things. It's just, we just don't have all the information. And right now, we're living in a time where we have more and more access to information. We're getting more and more things on the table, and we're getting more and more of an ability to say, is this a myth or is this an actual fact? And I think those are positive things. So, I don't know. Okay.
That's sort of the analogy one of our mutual friends makes, which I use a lot too, about how the internet did to the academia. The internet has done to academia and the media what the printing press did to the Catholic Church. It gave a much easier way of distributing information, so it could oppose the mainstream at the time and then show, okay, these people are lying, this is fake, this is corrupt, all that. And that's why there's such a crackdown on independent creators, especially on YouTube, because the church is fighting back, as it were. It's like they don't want it, they don't want that power to slip from their hands because they want to control the narrative.
Yeah. And that is a good thing, because I think it's not postmodernism. We might be entering a post-history kind of existence. At least some parts of the world are entering a post-history existence where in the sense where it's not his story, because in that sense, they're not even just like, oh, that white male story about that thing, or just his story as in, oh, that's his story because he won, so he's telling you the story, or just the basic aspect of, oh, that's just your story, that's just his story. No, we're getting to the point where you're just getting the story. The story is just being told. It's not even the people who try to do their best. We're trying to be as as unbiased as possible. We're literally just trying to put down, this is the information that I had. You're getting it third, fourth person. You're not actually there present. You don't actually have film, even eyewitness testimony, depending on how you were personally feeling at the time, where you were standing, what was going on. You could miss so much that was actually happening with that. But now we're living in a time where the story is actually there, where you will technically have actual things happen, where you have 360-degree cameras, full-on film, and everything. Everybody involved can actually say what they had, and it's this. The story of humanity now is actually going to be able to just be ongoing, where it's not necessarily going back to history. It's just an ongoing story that's just expanding and changing as time goes. It's being added to.
Well, I was thinking too, I was watching some old stuff after, well, not old, but I mean a few years ago after the election where the president of CNN said something like, oh, we made the mistake of playing all this unedited footage of Trump's rallies, and it's like you're basically admitting you don't want people to have the full story and make up their minds.
Yeah.
You want people to have this curated vision that you present and then base it off that. And again, that goes also to the internet, is that with the internet, that's more possible now. Like with the stuff going on in Portland, you have recordings of peaceful protesters, but you also have recordings of the violence. So you can look at those different angles and weigh it and make your own decision. Whereas in the past, you might have had a few outlets owned by a few companies that just present one angle and that's it.
Yeah. Okay, so the next quote, because that's one thing I'm wondering with this. And see, these are stories being told, these are commentaries being told by certain people. And the next one here is Wesley Morris's. So this is Wesley Morris's essay, his story, I guess, is the quote from his story was, for centuries, black music has been the sound of artistic freedom. No wonder everybody is always stealing it. Okay?
Well, it sort of relates to my point about science. Like, you know, there is a degree of truth to that about how there were a lot of black people left out of science. And they've talked about that with Elvis, how Elvis stole a lot of his music from black people. But then sort of the debate with that was that he was sort of, the argument for that is that he was sort of that midway point where people were like, hey, this is pretty good, where did he learn it? And that piqued an interest in black artists, which later, whereas if they had come out on their own and tried to be famous, it wouldn't have worked given the views of the time. Again, I'm not saying it's right, but looking at it from the perspective of that time. And I got to read it again, but I know Shelby Steele wrote some stuff about the different black musicians, about how they sort of made a name for themselves, and how Louis Armstrong, he used humor, like, you know, he has pictures of all the different faces and everything, and how people just didn't like his music, but he was able to entertain in a way that sort of resonated with everybody. Yeah. Whereas Miles Davis, if I recall, was more just, you know, I'm trying to think what he did exactly, but it was basically like, he didn't want to sort of cozy up to white people because he saw it as like, oh, this is me selling out, but his music still really caught on. So they had different ways of approaching this. Again, I'm not saying it's right, obviously, what they had to go through, but it's like, I think as this stuff becomes better understood, hopefully there are better ways of bringing new talent, better talent to the forefront, but at the same time, the other side of this is you sort of risk, you know, we risk glorifying all these things that aren't really that good. I mean, look at postmodern art, look at, you know, the whole body shaming thing now. It's like it went so far the other way of, no, only these voices can be heard, to, no, we have to listen to everybody. And it's like, you know, as you've been talking about with your whole What You Consume series, not everything is worth consuming. Sorry, you know, it's like, that may sound intolerant for me, but it's like, not every music is going to be good. Not all art is going to be good. Not, you know, you have to weigh what is good and bad and why, and then if it's bad, we either work on it or discard it, and something better comes along.
And one thing again with this whole thing, where I think my background is giving me some different points of view on this, is, okay, with black, as I've mentioned before, I think black speaks specifically of a certain tribe of people, both black and white. I think those two concepts speak specifically of a tribe of people that started in the United States of America that have built up, where you don't necessarily see that happening as much with the Asians. It's not like yellows. You don't hear them call themselves that because they still have a lot stronger ties to a lot older histories of the locations they come from. Like the Chinese Americans still have that strong Chinese American thing. The Japanese Americans still have that, and I think the amounts that they actually came to America wasn't in a similar way that the original European colonialists came in, colonists and things like that, and majority of the people were brought over in the much more disruptive sense of the transatlantic slave trade, because those were kind of detached. A lot of the Europeans were leaving because they were frustrated and did not want to be part of what their countries had become anymore. They were like, let's start anew. That was part of them. Unfortunately, with the transatlantic slave trade, they had been literally captured by their fellow tribespeople and sold off. So it was like, no, even if you wanted to maintain connection, you just didn't have the ability to do it. As we also discussed with the information, you weren't able to constantly be in contact with people passing back and forth. So there's so much that led to that I think uniquely develops that. Because when you talk about black music, when you look at a place like here in Kenya and you look at the matatus, which are the public service transport vehicles, and they have like Cardi B and like Lil Wayne and all these people painted on the sides of the bus, and you look at a lot of the music, the industries definitely have built up, and you see a lot more localized industries. But when I came back, I think when I was a kid here, I was like 5 to 10. At that time, there wasn't that big of a localized industry. So but people were beginning to copy hip hop, copy that kind of rock music. But even if you go with the hip hop, when you look at the hip hop, it came out of disco, and then disco itself wasn't necessarily that black of a thing. So there's all these connections. But would they consider what's happening in Africa by African musicians taking on the hip hop sounds, taking on the R&B sounds, taking on something like reggae? Is reggae actually from Africa, or is it from the Caribbean? If people think of reggae, they don't necessarily think of Ethiopia and these places. People think of Jamaica and the West Indies and things like that. So did they invent that there? Is that black people stuff? Or is that black people taking stuff from Africa? Then is it African? Like, what is the level? Then if an African artist who's never lived in the United States of America can take hip hop sound, is he stealing it?
Well,
Or
did you see Gangs of New York?
yes.
I was thinking of this scene where there's a black character dancing, and Bill the Butcher says something like, "What is that? You know, rhythms from the Dark Continent, Irish dancing or something." You throw it in, you have a great American mess, and then he calls them a racial slur and says dancing a jig. But that's where that came from. That was a combination of what the slaves took from their home, but it was also Irish step dancing, and then it just kind of became its own thing. So again, it's like, well, would you say it's Irish? Would you say, and then again, Africa is such a big place. You wouldn't say African. It came from some tribe somewhere in West Africa way back.
And in the Thomas Sowell book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, he talks about the history, about how the things mix together. And that's the thing that I think people need to appreciate about Americans. There's certain things that are uniquely exceptional about what the United States of America is. And to me, it's a bit distressing when I look back at people who have this rich history and this unique place to be in, and they seem to be very dismissive, if not actively against those things. Yeah. Now, part of why I say seem is because I still don't see these people leaving, because they can leave, but these people still stay there. So their ultimate action of not leaving, to me, kind of goes against the words that they're saying. So maybe I'm just misunderstanding what they mean by always stealing it, what they mean by sound of artistic freedom, because these people, they have Jimi Hendrix as a photograph here in the back, and there's other people in the collage of the thing, like someone like Beyonce there, and I think, but the things that they're using, the music industry, the instruments themselves, weren't those also kind of invented by white people, they would say? So did they take the whole writing down of music notes that that Beethoven and all those people were getting into the sounds and the mixtures and the things like that and the rhythms, and then getting radio itself and getting on the radio? All these things, weren't those white inventions that also helped create, just like I did that recent video talking about, like, we talk about all the white people that the slave trade, all the black people that the slave trade killed by white people, but then do we talk about all like the medicines that have resulted in people being alive today that were also invented by white people? Like, should we have like a tally? Like, okay, white people were involved in the slave trade that killed 2 million people, but then a white person invented penicillin that resulted in saving 20 million black people. So they're on a plus 18 million. Like, where does this end?
That's like what I was saying earlier with my Rockefeller example. Oh, this evil guy took over the economy and made all this money. But the price of kerosene was falling. He was buying out oil wells. He was paying people so much for the oil wells they could retire off of what he was willing to pay for them. They say there was no record of him yelling at his underlings. He gave tons to charity. He founded the University of Chicago. But again, in school, we're not taught all those positive things. It's just the negative. And that's sort of my criticism. It's that unbalanced perspective of it's just, it's all these negatives, but then it's like you leave out all the good stuff or you take it for granted. That good stuff didn't just emerge out of nowhere. No.
Yeah, and okay, with that one, I think that might be one of the things that people say. We focus too much on the good stuff and not enough on the bad stuff. But as I mentioned before, I think the United States of America is more than other places, and that's part of the whole freedom of speech thing, is that they talk about the bad stuff in their history, I think, a lot more than I've seen other places talk about the bad stuff in their history. Like, that's something that, to me, even if it's not just the fact that it's known, with other places, it's just not there. You're not going to go to China and hear about Tiananmen Square that there's film of.
Yeah.
It's actual film of things like that. But you don't hear about those things. Those things are suppressed. That is not what's going on in the United States of America. Not when you can have, like the recent thing, you can have the mayor of the biggest city in your country literally have their daughter be arrested for out there protesting for Black Lives Matter, goes and paints Black Lives Matter with a bunch of other people on the street in front of the president's old residents or current residents of the country, and then send those police that you say are part of some structuralized thing holding you institutionalizedly racist, take 30 of those police people and tell them they have to guard this from other people coming and doing things to it. And that is oppression? To me, that's oppression. Sorry, let me finish up. If that's oppression, that shows how exceptional the United States of America is, that is what it means to be oppressed in the United States of America.
Well, I brought it up a few times, but I wrote it to someone in the comments today about how I keep laughing as people make this, Hitler comparison. I'm like, do you think Hitler would have let people protest? If they had attacked a building, he would have sent troops in with live ammo, shot them all, had their families killed or sent to camps. Like, I was reading when Reinhard Heydrich was killed, they actually found something associated with the assassins in a town. They leveled the town and sent all the people into camps just because this one guy was killed.
And that's the thing. So,
imagine if there was an actual uprising, like, that would not have been tolerated.
And that's where my question comes. So I have these conversations: is do they mean, when they say black music, what do they mean? When they say stealing, especially when they say no wonder everybody's always stealing it.
Yeah.
I would not write something like that, even on a blog, because that is, to me, those words are so, they're so ultimate. Everybody. First of all, it's not everybody stealing it. Get out of here. Always. What do you mean always? You can't literally mean always. Then what do you mean by stealing it? How is it stealing it? This is something that I am sensitive to as an artist, as somebody that's artistically inclined. They got to a point where it's like, I don't want to copy anything ever. But then if I take something, can I truly create anything artistically that's never been created before? Or the fact that I'm using perspective, the fact that I'm using paints, the fact that I'm using this anatomy, things that have been invented by other people, am I stealing that from them? Or am I just adding to this human story that I'm talking about? Why do we need these definitions or divisions and be like, that's black music, that's black people only allowed to do this? But then you have someone like, before I was talking about, if I'm doing that, if I all of a sudden start doing art, if I create art, is that black art? Is it Kenyan art? Is it French art because I was born in France? Why can't it just be something Silas?
You do a marble sculpture, is that Greek art or Roman art?
Yeah. And I also did a separate video about this where it was like and this is not just done on black people's side. This is also something that's done by white people. It's done by racial identity. What's the term?
Identitarian.
Identitarians. That's it. And I had a video talking about this with this woman who did this amazing sculpture of this female body, and somebody came on there and they're like, this is what the Western ideal is. We should bring this look back. This is a good expression of Western art coming back in Western sculpture. And it was done by somebody who was ethnically Chinese, but she left China. Now she lives in France and she's married to like an Italian or something. And that's just what she studied, and she was creating this. But that person was an identitarian, and they were like, "Yeah, white people. This is like pro-white art now." It's like, does that matter? Why bring all that into the actual act of actually creating something?
Well, I like what Wilfred Riley said too, because I mean he was criticizing the whole concept of cultural appropriation, which is just absurd in general. But then he makes the point that some people will argue, well, certain groups have a right to appropriate others because they were oppressed by them. But then he makes the point, but that runs into contradictions too. So it's like, by that logic, can Turkish people not enjoy Greek stuff because they conquered them a while back, and Italians not enjoy British stuff because Britain was part of the Roman Empire? Can we not enjoy stuff in the Middle East? It's like, where do you draw the line? Like, it's just. And the thing is, too, you're just censoring trading, which makes mankind poor. And if you care about bringing mankind up, you want ideas to spread as much as possible.
Yeah. But you see, that's the thing. They're censoring trading, and look at the things they call capitalism. And with that history of the word capitalism, we're talking about how history has changed, how words change and things like that, how things are unknown. If they have, whatever understanding they have of capitalism is definitely not what I had in mind when I say capitalism. And I agreed. I'm leaving that word. I'm going to start talking about free markets instead of the. Or if I say capitalism, I'll specifically say free market capitalism. Just like this person qualifies it with American capitalism, just to make sure, because they clearly don't. They seem, not clearly, to me, it seems they don't understand what that is. They don't understand the value of markets,
No,
especially the most important one of trade of ideas. Yeah. What?
There's no clear definition on what the word is, and then does it fit that? It's just, let's keep making it up as it goes.
Okay, so the next one here, I slide my ring finger from Senegal to South Carolina and feel the ocean separate a million families. From a poem on the Middle Passage by Clint Smith, read more original literary works created for this 1619 project. All right. So they're being more specific with the region of the area, and well, million families. But you see this when you tie that in, you say million families. Was it a million families from Senegal to South Carolina? And this is just a question about this. You read it. Did they actually discuss? Is it specifically United States of America focused, or did they discuss how majority of the slaves did go to the Caribbean and South America?
No, if I recall correctly, it's like Howard Zinn. They just talk about the U.S. But if you look at that chart, and I can send it to you. You've probably seen it. They talk about how 40% went to Brazil, majority went to the Caribbean, and I think it was like 400,000 came here. I mean, to be clear, obviously, any are too much, anyone going through that is horrible, and any is bad. But if you want to talk about percentages, it's actually a very small percentage.
Yeah.
But like when they say a million families, it's like, well, it wasn't even a million people.
Yeah.
So, you have to ask, okay, where did they go from,
And to me, that's what when you're talking about topics this important and this significant, I find it at least disingenuous when you start using things like that. When you start throwing those numbers out, it does a disservice to, I think. I don't know if it does a disservice because I don't know what they're thinking. Maybe it does a complete service to what they're trying to do. I don't know what their intentions are.
I would say it's their agenda, but and it sounds nice too. Like you're reading it, it sounds like it's well written, and again, that's why it won the award. But that doesn't mean it's accurate. It's I was in that book, The Art of Reasoning, that I was talking about. David Kelly has a good section where he talks about the fallacies, and he talks about advertisements. And one of the things he talks about is how, if you break down advertisements, they're actually pretty illogical. Like, a sports drink isn't good because an athlete says so. It's an appeal to authority and a non sequitur. But because people like that athlete, if they hold it up, smile, and drink it, people will buy it. But his point is, it's not illogical because they're not making the argument that, being good at a sport means you have a discerning taste in drinks. It's just they know you like that person, so you're more willing to trust them. It's an appeal to emotion.
Yeah, there is something to that. It goes back to that his story, where it's his story.
Yeah.
It's his story about the product. It's not what the product literally is. And to me, that is one of the issues I say. I think I have this quote where I think I came up with it, I came up with it, but then it's something other people have pointed out, where problems exist not because of what X is, but because of how we define X.
Yeah.
This goes with the history. People have a problem with the history of the United States of America because of how these people are defining the United States of America. I think if you asked your average American who was aware of the slave trade, how many actual slaves were brought into the United States of America, I think they would tell you millions.
Yeah.
I think if you told somebody, let's say you gave somebody the option between 4 million, let's say you say 10 million, 4 million, a million, or 400,000. I think most people would go with 4 million.
Yeah.
I think in general, most people would go with 4 million.
Yeah.
Even though 400,000 would be the most accurate. I don't think they would go always high to 10 million.
No.
But I think that would be a good question to just ask and see. But yeah.
Well, you saw that thing I posted. Did you see that thing I posted in the group today about bee stings?
Well, not today. I take the weekends off of.
Oh, that's right. So basically, I'm reading Wilfred Riley's book Taboo, which I highly recommend. After I watched that video with him on Thaddeus Russell, I started reading it. The book is interesting because it's called Taboo, and it's supposed to talk about like sensitive topics, but it's very data driven, and he really argues the case. And one of the points that he makes that really sticks with me is that if people knew the facts, we'd be a lot less polarized, there'd be a lot less sensationalism.
Yes.
Realize this stuff's blown way out of proportion. And it was interesting because, they talk about how many unarmed black men are killed by police. And they said the year BLM started, I think it was 17 in 2015. Last year it was 15. But, you have people, they'll say hundreds, thousands. Somebody said it was one person every 28 hours, which is complete bunk. And then he brought up another statistic. Yeah. But then he brought up another statistic, which is interesting. He said how many people died of bee stings, wasp, and hornet stings last year. Know how many it was? It was 89 people. So he made the point that statistically you're more likely to go outside and get stung to death than you are to be killed in that way.
It's the coverage and the stories that are being told definitely does change a thing. And a friend of mine who's not even that politically engaged, she's getting more politically engaged, but she sent me this thing saying number of people killed by law enforcement from 2010 to 2019. And the first country, I think, is New Zealand. That might be the New Zealand flag. I don't know what it is, but no, it's not the New Zealand flag. It's Norway. It says 1. And it's like 2 for Denmark, 6 for... What country is a white flag with a blue cross? Whatever that was. Switzerland is...
Sweden is the blue and yellow.
Yeah, I know Sweden's. Switzerland, red with the white cross on the side is 7.
That's Switzerland.
And I think Belgium here. No, that's not Belgium. Like 8 or something. Like I think green with green, red. Anyway, I might put it up here, but Poland I think is 13. New Zealand here is 14. Sweden is 21. The UK is 22. I think the Netherlands is 24. Now is that New Zealand or something else? Okay. Which one is like Fiji or something? Is Fiji and New Zealand have the same flag? Kind of one of them has stars on it.
New Zealand have a very close. I don't know what Fiji's like.
Yeah, well, okay, well, one of them has 14, the other one has 32. But then, actually coming back to that at the end of this, but 50 is France, 93 in Germany, 240 in Canada, then 15,008, 429, 15,008 total, but 429 in 2020 for the United States of America. And this is just posted. And then people in the comment section are like, yeah, that's this horrible place. Like, this is it's such a stupid, okay, not stupid, but what is the point of putting something like this up? First of all, with like Fiji has like 10,000 people. So if it's 14 or 32, that's a lot. If you take every given area in the United States of America and break it up to the size of Fiji with the number of people in there, then United States of America is like -1. You look at these places, it's concentrated amounts of people getting killed in certain areas. Are you talking about how many guns were actually being shot at the police while these people were shot? Like, how many of these people who were killed by law enforcement had just shot a bunch of other people? Like, it's this, people make certain statements, throw certain numbers out with just the context that completely missed by the context that these people are saying these things in.
Yeah. Well, it's also just laziness. It's like, they don't do the digging. And like he said, I mean, the data is there. And I mean, he cites, of course, FBI statistics. There's government statistics. There's a few think tanks. He cites some of Sol's work. I mean, the data is there. It's just like he says, it's framed in such a way that it stirs people up.
Like for me, I think one thing I've done, at least when it comes to discussing things on politics, is if somebody mentions numbers like in a case like this, and tries to compare a country the size of a continent like the United States of America to a place like Fiji. Like Fiji, I was already saying I was already accepting with just places like the Scandinavian countries that are the size of a state, have a population of 4 million people, which is like the size of like Los Angeles, in that wide of an area, and you're trying to complain just numbers without putting it into context that per capita or even equating the different demographics and considerations, the climate. There's so much that goes into it. Where if somebody does those two and brings the numbers up, I am just not going to engage with that person anymore because they're not being fair. You're not playing the same sport. You're not talking about the same things. If somebody thinks that makes sense,
it's like what you were saying to the guy in the comments about how if you're not going to debate a religious person who automatically writes you off as evil because you don't follow their religion, it's like you're immediately not playing the same game. And I've experienced that, as you know, with feminists, where it's like, oh, all white men are trash, blah blah blah. It's just like, why am I going to engage that? It's like you write me off as evil off the bat, and I can't have a reasonable conversation with you.
Yeah. Okay, so one more quote. What does a traffic jam in Atlanta have to do with segregation? Quite a lot. Okay, so I'm thinking this probably has something to do with white flight and zoning and things like this, but then how old is this street? How old are they planned for? Like, when was the voting? When were they set up? What is the current political system? Because in a lot of these places like Atlanta, I think it's predominantly Democrat. I think Atlanta is the most populated place by African Americans, by blacks in the United States of America. Wow. But you saw with the recent unrest, it's a black mayor. You normally have black people involved in the police commissioners, the aldermen, the school boards. Like they're represented, but the issues haven't gone away. Like, so what's going on? Like, because Trump is such a bad orange man, he's somehow created you guys to have. He somehow did some reverse time travel thing that even when Obama was in office, you still can bring all those black minds together to do things that were pro-black people, but at the same point, Asians seem to be doing well for themselves when they have control over certain power structures in their areas, even though they're a smaller percentage. Like, what it's like this to me, this is like curious. Like, what could it have to do? But I don't know. What's the link? Traffic Atlanta segregation. That's the link in the New York Times. The different. So yeah, I don't know. Did you read that part?
I mean, I don't think I read that part. I mean, it's been a little while since I read it all directly. But it's like you see all that stuff going on now with like the books that are being pushed and all that, and again, there's a certain degree of truth in certain things. Like I understand, like even where I'm from here, there's the issue with redlining, where I don't know how well you know my area, but Poughkeepsie was originally one big district as far as the school went, and then what happened was when a bunch of IBM people came up, they basically said, we don't want our kids going to school with black kids. So they set up SPAC and Kill separately, and that was basically like, that was basically, okay, these uppity IBMers, we don't want our kids going to these schools. But then what happened, unfortunately, was the good teachers all went to SPAC and Kill, so then the Poughkeepsie schools just deteriorated because it's safer over here, you'll get paid better, all that. So if they're talking about things like that, yes, it definitely applies. But you have to provide the evidence for it. And a lot of this stuff, these are just assertions.
And part of the thing that's missed, as we mentioned before, is they don't talk about the government aspect of this. You'll see things. They're talking about. You'll watch a documentary from PBS, which PBS is government funded. So I'm not too surprised when you see this, talking about all the drugs that have happened, the drug epidemic in the United States of America, and how communities have been targeted and this bad thing happened because this person was this selfish person who was just looking for the profits. But then the entire time, you hardly hear any mention that this was existing in a regulatory system that is ran by the state.
Yeah.
So they were allowing these things to happen. You don't hear that, oh, Fannie Mae was working with this company, and then they found out that this company was doing these huge, was involved in all sorts of fraud. So Fannie Mae stopped working with that company, but in the settlement, they decided, we're not going to tell anybody else that we stopped working because you're a fraudster. And then that person goes on and keeps defrauding other people for millions of dollars later. And like, what's going on here? So when you have this kind of situation, some of the problems that the people are bringing up, I'm not saying these problems don't exist, but who was enforcing these problems?
Yeah.
The things that they're claiming, we need more government to do X, Y, Z for us, to me, is a thing where in the African community, the black community, even in Africa, that's another thing. People seem to be so much on, oh, we need the government to do this for this. We need to add this for this. I'm like, don't go down this road.
Yeah.
This is not what we need. You need more liberty. You need the government to not be involved in your stuff because somebody else will get control over that government that you're going to build up that is not interested in your specific things.
But also the argument that comes up a lot too is that, you know, they don't. It might not even be that they do bad stuff. It's that they don't do anything at all, and that's kind of the criticism of like areas like Atlanta, where you just described, where they make all these lofty promises, they disappear. You know, they make all these lofty promises when they're running. You know, they come to power, they disappear, and then they come back, make more promises.
Yeah.
Like there's no incentive for them to actually improve things.
And people take it for granted, and I think that's something we've seen right now in this pandemic is people were expecting the state, the government, to do certain things for them. Oh, they're going to keep us protected. They know what they're talking about. They have all these things. And then this thing all of a sudden comes around the world and you see like, hey, there's actually places that didn't really have that much more government than your location. And how different is what's happening there? Like, it's so frustrating. This is such a frustrating situation when I look at some of these things. Where I'm just like, please, let's get more information. And maybe that's it. Maybe it's just not access to the actual information of what is actually there. If you actually do think somehow that 4 million people were taken, that will inform how you actually look at the actual effect of it happening right now, of what's happening right now.
Yeah. Well, you know, like I think somebody pointed out recently too, and I don't know if you follow AIER, it's the American Institute for Economic Research, and they've been writing some good stuff during this pandemic. And of course, you know, being economically inclined, they're going to talk about all the effects of the shutdown. And the point that someone made is like, that's not being talked about enough. It's just assumed, oh, we'll open up again, things will return to normal. And it's like, well, the longer you keep things shut down, I mean, I see all these businesses closing in the city, and then are they going to open again, as we discussed in the last video, with rising costs and things, who's going to invest again? I mean, you know, that minimum wage hike for tipped employees, you know, it put labor costs up. I think it was like 600% or something. It's like, what places can survive that? You can't. I mean, you know, profit margins are already low. So, you know, you take all these restaurants and everything for granted. But again, it's going to get to a point where people are going to say, why should I invest in this? It's not, I'll break even if I'm lucky at best. And it's, you know, why are you going to do that?
And that's what I'm hoping people don't do, and say, let's go back to this, because they take those things for granted. They think they're protected. They think the state will do these things for them. And that makes them not demand or search for actual results to those actual things, to actual means to help themselves in those ways. So you do kind of get indolent and kind of lazy in a way. Whereas if you didn't think you had that support, you would act in a different way. You would act accordingly and find ways to actually create those kind of support systems and help yourselves. I think it goes back to also the W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington kind of debate, where they were like, one was like, just let us be. The other one was like, oh, well, they give us to, what was the term he used? The select few? Select gifted? There was a term he used where it's like the 10% of the black community was the gifted who would be able to know what they'll be able to do and help the rest of the black community is. And that ethos, that feeling, I think, has been carried on by people like the Al Sharptons of the world, who feel like there is some class where we have the power to know what to do best for all these other people, yet you white people don't have the power, but we, the black elite, will know what to do for the black community, and it's a sickening thing.
Well, I mean, it goes back to Plato if you were to go back far enough, but it's basically the idea of false consciousness. And I don't know if you saw in that thread, one of my Facebook friends wrote that after you about, oh, he's saying you have false consciousness, basically like you don't know what's best for you. Give us power, we'll lead you to true happiness. But it's gaslighting, it's unfalsifiable. I mean, there's so many things wrong with that, but it's just people take that for granted.
And it goes back to the thing we were talking about with the voting, because there is that there where it's like I should be able to have a say on what you can do in other place. And then you take this further. Why, if you support universal suffrage in the United States of America, why shouldn't there be universal suffrage in the globe? Why shouldn't I be able to vote for the President of the United States of America? Why do they accept the arbitrary line of the state boundaries, yet they think everybody within those lines, because now they're saying, oh, we should have illegal immigrants just because they live in this location. They're literally just bringing it down to, you happen to be living in this place, so you should have a vote. But that place, United States of America, is within the boundaries of the place called the Earth. So why shouldn't I have a say over it?
Yeah.
Like, why should you all of a sudden, just at the border of Canada, somebody who's living right close to there, who could be living in the same town that straddles the border, why should they have no say over the president of that country that's making decisions based off of what their actual town does? It's universal suffrage. We're like, person's against universal suffrage. Person's horrible person. Okay, let me read another quote. Why doesn't the United States have universal health care? As we're talking about universal things. Sorry, okay, why doesn't the United States have universal health care? The answer begins with the policies enacted after the Civil War. Essay by Janine Interlandi. Yeah, what?
Yeah.
So somehow, something that happened in the Civil War has kept the United States of America from universal health care, but other countries that had civil wars that have it. Why does Cuba have it, but the United States of America doesn't?
Yeah.
And then
I mean, it's a whole conversation in of itself, but like, there's so many variables here that people don't look at. Like, somebody said, there's three factors you have to look at in healthcare. It's affordability, universality, and quality. And then the issue for us is that, of course, here in this country, the quality is great, but it's very expensive and not everyone has it. But then you go to countries like Canada or England, it's universal and it's affordable, but there's all these issues with waiting times, Molyneux having to get cancer surgery, they're telling him you have to wait years, so he came down here, things like that. And then certain countries, I have to look into it, but I think like the Scandinavian countries, they all have it, but the thing is their taxes are through the roof, so it's like, yeah, you all have it, and the quality is decent, but you're paying through the nose in taxes, so it's like, it's a wash either way. Like, there's nobody who gives everyone top-notch health care. It's not possible.
Yeah. And then we're also talking about the size of the country, the people involved. Like, this is one thing I've thought. You probably your average Black American, your average pet of a Black American has better access to healthcare than your average sub-Saharan African human.
Yeah.
Like, so when they're talking about universal healthcare, what do they mean by that? Like, it's again where I'm saying people seem to be very myopic and focused on just who's above them in that limited location and not putting it onto the greater world. I would say there's probably more Negroes in the United States of America that have been tested for COVID than the entire sub-Saharan Africa. So we're talking about a population of maybe out of 10 million or so Black people. It's like 40 million Black people, but let's say like 10 million, which in certain locations of high. We were talking about how the discrepancy of places in Chicago, I think Atlanta, they're saying, oh, there's way more Black people percentage-wise who are testing positive for this. But you take those major metropolitan areas, there's probably 2 million or 3 million people being tested, Black people, tested in those areas. That's definitely more than the entire East Africa. I would probably even venture to say those people are probably more tests than the entire sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
So what is the healthcare that you're talking about? Now, in sub-Saharan Africa, what system are they talking about that has reduced sub-Saharan Africa from having this supposed grand idea of universal healthcare that just make everything hunky-dory for everyone involved in it? Like, what's going on? Does Cuba have universal healthcare? Is Cuba doing better with the war? North Korea has universal healthcare, right?
Yeah.
And they have like 0 reported cases. So that must be the case that they're using for this. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like, the thing about the Cuban healthcare system, right, where Michael Moore did that thing, and then they showed that he went to a hospital reserved for American VIPs and higher-ups in the Cuban government military. So it's like, it's not like the average person on the street gets that kind of treatment. That's the point. Yeah.
I've been to some average hospitals here in Kenya.
Yeah.
And it's bleak. It's not a good situation, and that's what I'm saying. With some people, they take certain things for granted in the United States of America, and it's that American dream. It's like, wake up. Like, I hope people actually did become woke. Wake up from the American dream, see the American reality, and understand the things that it took and takes to have become the United States of America, maintain the United States of America, and keep those things, because things don't just exist in a vacuum. It's in comparison to what, like Thomas Sowell said again. Thomas Sowell 3, the 3 questions. At what cost? What solid proof do you have? And
compared to what?
Yes, compared to
at what cost?
And you ask those 3, and America scores really well in pretty much every single situation.
What's interesting, too, is I was also reading that book criticizing Howard Zinn, and what's interesting is that he was another one like this project that it wasn't just criticized by people on the right, but also by other Marxists. Like, other Marxists say this book is simplistic. Marx himself didn't have such a simple view of history, and like, I sort of thought about that, and it kind of makes sense because, like, if you read the stuff that Marx was saying, obviously he wanted socialism as the ideal, but he argued that feudalism and capitalism were necessary steps to get there. But it wasn't, these systems were pure evil and utopias on the other side. It was more, these were necessary steps to get to something bigger. It wasn't, everything's terrible, overthrow the system, and then we'll have utopia. No. It's like, he had a bit more of a nuanced view. And you said you stay off on the weekends, but I posted one of Phil Magnus's comments about how one of the things he was saying is how he actually prefers the classical Marxists to the critical theorists because for all their flaws and their horrible worldview, at least, they were sticklers for facts, and they knew the philosophy, economics, all that. There were those rigorous debates on those things. Whereas these people will just flat out make stuff up and then name call you, and it's just like, again, for all their flaws, at least there was a certain commitment to facts, and they actually duked it out over, there's a gap between the rich and the poor. Is that because of capitalism or is that the money supply? Like, there were those debates. It wasn't just, no, this is what you're supposed to think, don't question it.
That to me is one thing I will second echo, is that even when it comes to something, the fundamentalists, the people who have those things where they have the principles and they have the definitions that they're actually willing to establish this means something, they definitely are people that are more willing to have discussions with versus the people who just...
I think many don't know what they believe. That's the thing. It's just like, oh, I'm told to think this, now I believe this. It's like what I was saying earlier, the people, I believe in science. Well, social distancing is important. Now, don't go out to the lockdown protest. Oh, now protesting BLM is okay. Oh, you don't wear a mask. Now you should. It's like they themselves don't understand the science. It's just, well, I was told to think this in here and now, and I'm changing my opinion accordingly.
It is frustrating, and it is a thing where it's like I think this is something we mentioned, had to talk about right before the actual started recording, but the whole thing where it's not even moving the goalposts. It's just there are no goalposts.
Yeah.
Where it's like there's a field, we've entered the field, and we're like, okay, we're playing football, and there's goalposts on both sides, there's yard markers, and there's something we're doing on this field for a certain purpose. And then it's like other people just walk in from the stands or whatever, and just start walking around the field, doing things, occasionally grabbing the ball and running, then just throwing it on the ground and being like, or occasionally celebrating things. And then you ask them, okay, what are you doing on the field? What's your point? There is no field. There's like, what are you talking about goalposts? We don't see any goalposts. We're just on the field. Like, we're just here. And those are the people I just can't. I just can't anymore. I just won't. I won't. I can, but I won't. I won't. I just won't.
Because, like, Rothbard was pointing out in his critiques of Marx how, like, they did shift the goalposts too, but again, there were certain, there were actual goalposts. Like, it was like, oh, the gap between the rich and the poor will widen, and then it's, well, no, the workers did better and they became a middle class, and then it's, oh, well, I meant relative impoverishment. It's like, well, no, they continued to do better. Then it was, okay, what about people in the third world? Therefore, so again, obviously, they're still shifting the goalposts, but at least there were sort of guidelines. Now it's, it's like, what is success for you? And that's what I keep saying about de Blasio in the city. I'm like, all these businesses are closing, crime, people on his own side are saying he should get out. It's just like, if this is success, like, I don't even want to know what failure looks like.
Okay, next quote. Slavery gave America a fear of black people and a taste of violent punishment. Both still define our prison system. Essay by Brian Stevenson. So with this one, I think one of the things I definitely point out when they talk about specifically the prison industrial system, which I have massive issues with, bears repeating. But I define the state as any given entity that has a monopoly of violence over a given area. So I don't think they have established themselves as an authority, as a justifiable authority to imprison people, because the state themselves do things that if a regular person would do under those system of this justice system would be imprisoned, but they're given an out for it. Yeah. This is the same thing where I have an issue with the general Christian description of God. I was talking about something like with the hell. Like, from what I've heard about hell, anybody who created something as horrific as hell would be the only person who would deserve to be in hell. So from what hell is defined as by certain people, the only being that I've ever thought of that would deserve eternal punishment would be a being that could create a place in the system that damns other beings to eternal punishment. So God is the only one who should be in hell. So with some of these things, the only people that should suffer during the prison industrial complex are the state that do certain things that establish the system. But taking all that campaigning or politicking aside, the main issue, the main discrepancy here, any discrepancy you see between black people and any other race is exponentially there between males and females for similar crimes. So are they saying there is something that America has a fear of men and a taste of violently punishing men, and both still define our prison system because there's an exponentially more amount of men imprisoned than females? Would they take that argument and put it there? And I've never seen them do it.
No, because that's something that comes up with the feminists too, where they talk about, oh, women earn less, all those statistics, and we point out, like, well, men will get harsher sentences for the same crime, but of course there's no pushback against that. But like you say, but then they will bring up, oh, black men are more likely to be accused or arrested of same things, but then they don't point out that it's more men than women there too. But, again, if you're going to use intersectionality, doesn't that mean there should be more women because they're more under attack? Like, I don't know, it's just like, it starts to fall apart.
Yeah, and there's definitely issues with this, and if you look at this and you say there is an issue of America having a fear of black people and a taste of violent punishment, let's get out of the whole situation of victimless crimes, which, as I've mentioned, I do, from what I've said here and talked about before, shouldn't be surprising that I think victimless crimes should be there shouldn't be a thing as a victimless crime in general. If there's no victim, where's the crime?
Yeah, exactly.
But, so you have that, but you look at situations where there actually is a victim, where there actually is somebody who has been aggrieved and harmed by that person that is imprisoned. You will find that majority of these black people that are supposedly disproportionately put into jail, most of them had actually targeted and victimized a black person.
Yeah.
So you could almost say, like, wait, there's more people in jail for hurting black people than per capita than they are for hurting white people per capita. So are you letting the people who hurt white people just go free? Is that what people's contention is? Like, if you go out there and kill a white person, you'll get away. If you're white and you go out and kill a white person, you'll get away because, it's just white people. But then if you're black and you kill a black person because somehow slavery and fear of black people will be like, oh, let's get this black person in jail for killing that black person.
Yeah.
If they didn't really care, if they hadn't fear for them, wouldn't they not care? Wouldn't they, like, let's just leave these criminals out in black communities and just have them kill each other off? Is that the actual argument? because some of the system, I have an issue with the system because bureaucracy, because of the state, because of the nature of it, the monopoly and violence and lack of competition and lack of sharing of ideas, it creates a system where even if they meant well, they're not, it's not a structure that is built in a way to create the best results. I don't think the government is out there trying to get as many people infected with the pandemic as possible.
No.
But I also don't find governments to be the kind of structures that are any way organized to best deal with these issues.
Well, I got to find the article for you, but I posted it some time back, but it talked about how a lot of the drug laws were pushed for by black legislators as basically a way of keeping drugs out of their area. And
Yeah.
not only that, like, you know, the crack laws, that's why those were harsher, because the idea was we want to keep this stuff out of our area, it's going to destroy our neighborhoods. And one of them, actually, one of the legislators, I forget which one, but he even wanted the death penalty for drug dealers. Like, he was like, this doesn't go far enough, we need to shut this down. And it's interesting because the author who wrote the article talks about how they talked about that book, The New Jim Crow, which talks about, you know, the system unfairly imprisoning black people. But then this author, this article, went to interview that author and they declined. So it's like, do you really care about ideas, or, you know, is it just your agenda? And that was sort of the issue that I had, because they explained how originally these laws were pushed because they said we need to keep drugs out of our area, but then they realized, okay, who did it disproportionately affect? And then they started walking it back, but at that point all those laws were in place, and as we know, the state tends to grow, it doesn't give up power. But, you know, the monster they created was then turning on them, but it's like, you know, they're stuck in that position where it's like, they would have to repeal all that stuff, but it's very hard because there's so many, you know, the cartels are so powerful, who they influence is just, yeah, it's very hard to undo.
Yeah, and that's a tough thing to kind of weigh out. Like, now with the people we're talking about here, we have biases, we have our agendas. What is the bias and agenda between the 1619 Project? Are they trying to harm people? Are they trying to are they doing the best that they can for themselves and for the people that they care for? And I think that's what most people are like. But people do have those personal biases where those politicians who are doing this, in the structure that they're in, the system that they're in, they'll see that there are some benefits, both in keeping their job as a politician and helping certain people that they care for. But are they looking at the bigger picture? Do they even have the ability to even see the bigger picture? Is there enough information to be presented with a bigger picture? And I think in many cases, they were not. That's why you see... Sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
and that was the thing. Like, you know, in fairness to what I just talked about, you can't call them bad people because they were trying to do the right thing, we could say. It's just they didn't realize it was unintended consequences. My criticism of things like 1619 is that it's that they're deliberately omitting, they're distorting, and they're not, you know, the fact they're, like you say, they're not putting a goalpost, they're just kind of being vague, and then when they're challenged on any of this by all sorts of people all over the spectrum, they're just dismissing it as, oh, this is just prejudice or whatever, and it's like, you know, it's either they're so entrenched in that echo chamber they can't see otherwise, or more likely they're just lying and they're trying to deflect anything that'll pick apart their narrative.
Yeah. And to me, that's the thing.
And that's why I sort of got annoyed the other day in that discussion. Is like, you know, there's nothing wrong with telling that perspective, but if you're doing bad scholarship to do it, that's where I have a problem.
Yeah, and that's for me too. I have no problem with somebody walking around or just going around and telling people 1 + 2 is 4. You can just go out and tell as many people and publicize that and put millions of dollars toward your advertising campaign of saying 1 + 2 is 4. Do all that if you want. It's wrong. I don't agree with it. And my issue is if I go out and I'm just like on my own self and talking to people, be like, no, it's actually 3. Because look, here's 1 thing, here's 2 more things, that's actually 3 things, and that comes before the number 4. And then the person who's saying 1 + 2 is 4, they come down and say, this person is racist, this person is hateful, this person isn't allowed to speak about this, or pretend that number 3 doesn't exist, or 3 is just a made-up thing that I just made up because I'm trying to make that person look bad. That's the part that I object to. Yeah. So the content, you can say all white people are evil. You can be white and you can say that just by virtue of you being white, you're better than me because I'm a Negro. Say it all you want, but it doesn't change the actual reality of what's going on. And my problem is when that person takes that thing that is wrong and then tries to overwrite what reality actually is based off of it. That's where I have an issue.
And that's what I've noticed. That's been my criticism of all these people, like whether it be Anita Sarkeesian, whether it be AOC, whether it be the people in this. It's like they don't want to have a debate. They don't want to have a conversation. They just want to live in that echo chamber, and they want to find ways to impose it on other people. And then if you question it or disagree in any way, they try to destroy it. That's the problem that I have. And it's like, and that goes to, my commentary and the whole video you did on the other day about, well, who needs an echo chamber? I mean, if you have to impose it on other people and you have to shut out dissenting voices, that's proving you need an echo chamber.
Yeah. Okay, so I think this is the last quote. The sugar that saturates the American diet has a barbaric history. The sugar that saturates the American diet has a barbaric history as the white gold that fueled slavery. Essay by Khalil Gibran Muhammad. Okay, so when someone says Muhammad here, this is the thing. Like I'm saying, like this person probably is Arabic. So to me, there is some aspect, the little actual aspect of ancestral identity that I have when I hear this. I'm like, yeah, well, the Arabs, the Muslims, kind of were engaging with slave trade, and the places that have the most actual things closest to chattel slavery right now, most of them in the Middle East, predominantly Muslim countries. So when you're taking gripe with something that happened, talking about white gold and all these things, how about you check out things like what Muhammad was saying about these kind of things? How about a bit of that? Like maybe he does that too. I'm not sure. So let me not just say that as is. But I also have issues with the whole dietary thing. I'm a recovering fat person. You're in the food industry. We had you are what you consume. So we're involved in that kind of thing. Again with the diet thing. The food pyramid is there. As I mentioned, the state is garbage at what it does. The state was trying to help kids somehow and indoctrinate them in some other kind of way. There's other benefits of doing this. I know there's the corn lobby and all these things, other benefits of doing that. But just the structure itself, that was also programmed. That was also messaged to white people. It was also messaged to Latinos. It was also messaged to Asians. So why are they somehow saying this is focused on just slavery that is somehow targeting black people? Now they have all these candy bars in there. It's not like an Asian person walks by these candy bars with $1 and can't purchase that candy bar like a black person can't.
Yeah.
And I know there's the food deserts. I know there's all these things, but come on, what?
Well, I know too. I was going to say Korean and Japanese desserts actually aren't very sweet either. So, like most Korean places, they don't even serve dessert, and then Japanese, you might get mochi or some ice cream maybe, but they won't have extravagant cakes and things.
Okay, so the sugar that saturates the American diet, and also this recent thing we're talking about, we had a recent status where we're talking about the waste gap in the United States of America, like they need to redistribute the extra calories. Because you have a place like here, the average African American has a certain daily access to calories that's probably 1,000 higher than your average Negro in sub-Saharan Africa. Sure. So is that a positive or is that a negative thing? Where is the personal decision making to say we can choose whether we're going to take this sugar? You look at the obesity rate. It's not, I know it's higher in the African American community per capita on average, but it's still killing a whole bunch of white people. So are these racist white people just saying, as long as we still kill more black people, we're going to accept the kill of these swaths of white people? And where is the areas of white people? I think in the countryside, certain areas, you'll find a lot more rotund and heavy people than other locations. So there are aspects that go into it. But then when it comes down to it, why do certain people in certain communities, in certain areas, make the decision that I'm going to just go with this basic genetic urge that we've had for carbohydrates, for sugars, and let that control my messaging? As you said something about advertising before, right? With like the sodas and things like that. It's like, why are some people more susceptible to that advertising? Why was I more susceptible to some of that advertising 10 years ago when I was grossly obese than I am now when I can be like, okay, I'm going to diet. I'm going to have a whole food diet. I'm going to like cut down to like one meal a day. I'm going to check my actual amounts of calories. So even if I have a day where I'm like, I'm just going to have a pizza, it's all I eat because that still keeps me at like 2,000 calories. And these are things that anyone can do.
I can't speak for other people, but in my experience, I mean, my weight kind of fluctuates. Like I started working out again, I've gotten a little out of shape, but for me, it's thinking long term versus short term. Like when you're a kid, you know, you're just focused on the here and now, and oh, this tastes good, I'm going to enjoy it. But then, I think when you mature, you start to think longer term about what am I going to have health issues down the road because of this. Like, you know, my father's very good about that. Like right now, like he eats less red meat. He often gets things without the skin on. He tries to get turkey sausage instead of pork sausage. But he's thinking long term because, again, it's not just how long you live, it's also quality of life. Like, you'd hate to have a stroke or a heart attack, and then your brain is damaged, and you have to live half paralyzed for another 20 years. You know, and those are serious risks. So I'd say part of it's maturity and just thinking longer term. But, I mean, that was my case. I don't know, I can't speak for everyone else, but...
Yeah. And then there is also things where there are genetic aspects. As I mentioned before, they were talking about myths of physical differences. No, there's actual differences. Otherwise, you know, if everything was good for the goose, if everything was good for the goose, was good for the gander, we'd all be geese. So the fact that these people talk about something about black, they acknowledge there is a difference between black people and white people. Not just cultural, but goes down to the actual racial aspect. Some people have a predisposition to certain things. And this is known information. And I have seen there are some targeted actual events and things like that to say that, hey, like within this community, we should not actually be focused. We have a higher propensity to get diabetes, so we should focus on doing this. And they are focused things on that. So I'm just wondering how much is that where that actual effect is being done? And maybe this person thinks that taking part in the 1619 project, and maybe somehow this actually does raise the awareness about that issue. There might be somebody it's definitely at least one person in the African American community who didn't know there was a discrepancy in that diabetes thing, and they read it in the 1619 project, and that was the first time it actually came to them. So maybe there is an aspect of this. I don't know.
Well, I think it's like a lot of people supporting the protests. Like, they're not really sure what's going on, but they feel like they're doing the right thing. And maybe, like my friend the other day, they feel like, oh, this is presenting things that haven't been told, and because it's emotionally satisfying, I like it. But they haven't looked deep into it and said, okay, is this valid? Yes or no? What are the criticisms? And as we keep saying, I mean, we're all biased to a point, and, you know, David Kelly talks about that in his book too, but that's the whole point of learning reasoning and logic, is that you learn to examine your own biases and say, okay, you know, is this worth it? Like, you know, you read something about climate change, you have to say, okay, was this written by a fossil fuel company that, you know, they want to keep polluting, but at the same time, okay, was this written by green energy consultants who will get paid a lot if their ideas are implemented? Like, you have to weigh all those, you know. And again, it's like, he's very smart in the way he words it, is that he's not taking either side. He's just saying you have to examine those biases and sort of say, you know, you can obviously be biased and still be right, but is that also influencing what they're getting at, how they're saying it, what they're omitting, etc.?
Yeah, because you wonder if something like this is slavery like shorthand for the devil, where it's kind of like a parent might not completely believe in their religion anymore, but they feel if I tell my kid not to do this because of the devil, the kid will somehow do that more. So I think it would be positive if people in general had a more awareness and understanding of how much sugar is in their actual diet and what it does to the human body. Do they feel that we have to throw in that white gold fueled slavery to make it stick in somebody's mind, where that's the only way we can mess with them? I just find that's an extra that.
I think again that's part of why it won the award, is that it's kind of that dramatic flair, and of course, you know, white gold, of course, also slang for cocaine and other things. So it has a few different connotations where, you know, it sounds kind of dramatic, and I think it's phrased in such a way that, like our discussion about advertisements, where it appeals to emotions, but, you know, that's what brings people in, and because they like the narrative, but because they're so emotionally wedded to the narrative, they're not willing to question it. And that's one of the things I like about in James Lindsay and Bogosian's book, is they talk about how to know if someone is worth talking with or not. They ask them, what would it take for you to give up this belief? And if they say absolutely nothing, it's like, well, you're wasting your time, because then it's like, you know, for emotional reasons, for, you know, whatever it is, you know, they've invested so much time, they're wedded, you know, whatever the reason is, it's like, it's pointless having a discussion because they're not going to change. But the point is, if it's someone who says, okay, I'm not genuinely willing to see this other argument, then it's like, okay, that's worth the conversation. Because like they said, I mean, Boghossian, I think, actually got his dissertation by, I'm trying to think if he was interviewing prison inmates or what, but he was talking to people who did horrible stuff, and he was helping to rehabilitate them. That was like his thing. And he was saying that's where he learned a lot of this material, is that you have to think, like, are these people who are capable of being saved, or are these people who are just lost, no matter what?
Yeah, and that is something to keep in mind. That's something that I do ask myself, and not that I think I'm some kind of savior of people, but just that whole part where in your own reality tunnel, in your own interactions with people, that is a thing. I think most people value being correct, value being right, value reality, and I think there is a benefit that everybody feels if they think they have imparted some information to somebody that corrects them about something they were wrong about, or if you've imparted and passed on added to somebody's awareness of what really exists. I think in general, most human beings get some kind of profit from doing that, feel good from doing that. There is some kind of reward inherently from doing that. So, and that's one thing, again, like as we are being critical about this, I don't think these are bad actions. I really do think most of these people involved in this were doing it in saying, by me doing this, it's going to make the world, personally for themselves to begin with, because I am an individualist above it all, even though they might deny it and say they're doing it for a collective. They're starting with themselves and then going out to a general collection of people that they value and care for and want a better world for them. Yeah. And that might be at the detriment of other people, but they're not doing it directly just to harm those other people. It is more pro those people. There's a pro that starts. Profit drives pretty much everything. Full capitalist.
But it's also, it's interesting because I was talking to one of my friends I used to work with about this. Like, we talked about how in 2016 how a lot of people started becoming more vocal, and then people, these friendship groups started splitting up and things, and there were even stories of people getting divorced and things. And what we sort of said on that, we said it then, we're saying it again now, is like, what I told my friend is, I'm like, it's not that it's dividing people, it's just revealing where the divisions are. People are figuring out, what do I believe, where I stand, and then you can use that as an opportunity to find people that you have true connections with, whereas in the past, some of these people you might have worked with and might have known from school, but like, were you really close? And I've asked that with a lot of coworkers that I've had, like, many of them are nice people, but I ask myself, would I hang out with this person if I knew them just as a person outside of work? A lot of times, no. Again, it doesn't mean they're a bad person, it's just there's no real connection there. So yeah. I think it's sort of a similar thing, and I think with one of my friends, because she's becoming more vocal, she's starting to see this, and I told her, I'm like, you just have to figure out what do you believe and then find people accordingly. But if before you were just kind of going along with the herd, well, yeah, I mean, the herd can lead you off a cliff too, as they say.
Yeah, and part of that is positive, because in trying to understand what you feel and discussing with people, it makes you realize that some of the things you believed were not true as well. And that makes you in a better position in your life. Yeah. And as I mentioned with the state, people think, oh, because I vote the government in or the state will do this for me. Yeah. They think that's handled, and then when the actual danger comes, they realize it wasn't handled. No. And that's how it is. You think, oh, this is my good friend. They're going to be there for me. And then when you actually need that person to be there, you realize that they're not there. That thing was never there. But then now it's a time where you should make sure, you should confirm, is that actually there? And that is to your benefit. That is, to me, I think that's part of why I'm doing this, because I think there's people in the United States of America who are saying certain things about America need to change, when I'm like, no. Those things, from what I've seen, are the reason America is awesome. Like, if you throw those things away, you are not going to like what you're left with.
Yeah.
Like, it's going to be a mess, because look at all these other countries that don't have those things, and you'll see that. And there's a gap there, and we're talking about with the profits. As I was talking about the feelings, I think this can transition to this next quote. Like, the wealth. What is wealth? Like, let me just read the quote and finish it up. Okay. A vast wealth gap driven by segregation, redlining, evictions, and exclusion separates Black and white America. It's an essay by Trymaine Lee. And wealth, to me, means a lot of things. But just like we're talking about the capitalism where people are like different things, but profit to me is not synonymous to currency or money. Profit, there's so many other ways to profit. There's so many other ways to be wealthy. And America has the most wealth of just freedom. And that's why, despite people talking about the oppression, they stay in America because I think they're aware of certain freedoms and things, and even the potential of improvement. Instead of them saying, I'm going to leave this country and go to that country, which maybe it's not as bad now, but I have a better chance of making that country what I think it is. Even for them, people who seem to be anti what I think some of the key parts of America are, liberty and individualism, they still somehow think, even if they say, oh, I'm a collectivist, I'm a communist, they still somehow think that America will be the best place for them to become communist rather than going to countries that have embraced the communism and just making those places more communist. So they already realize there is a wealth in America that is unique to America by not leaving America and by so many people trying to get to America. Yeah. So I think there is that kind of perceived wealth gap in America inherently. Now, the segregation, redlining, evictions, exclusion, black and white only, I guess they're focused on black and white here. Segregation exists, but that's being brought back by Black Lives Matter, saying black-only spaces and things like this, black-only voices for these kind of things. Black-only people can talk about this. Redlining, that is a thing. That wasn't just done off of races. It happened, a lot of African Americans, black people lived in cities, so that happened, but it also happens in rural areas where it's predominantly white. Evictions.
Like what I described.
Evictions, that's across races. That's been done on nationalities. That's done like Irish neighborhoods, Italian neighborhoods, who have different controls for different tribal reasons, in groups, out groups. Exclusion is by definition just, I think, a basic thing where tribal beings, groups, I think, are more defined about who's not in the group rather than who's in the group, or the lies you tell than who's in it. And then, as I said, black and white America, that's, I guess this is focused on black and white America, so I guess, but there are also other separations. There's black and Jewish America, as we've seen recently. There's Asian and Latino America. These divisions exist. Yeah. So the wealth gap, what I mean, because for me, like the wealth gap, the one the clearest thing is just Asians are invisible when the wealth gap is discussed.
Yeah.
And the treatment, especially when you talk about something like Japanese Americans, I know it's a much smaller percentage of the people, but you look at what happened to people like Japanese Americans just during World War II and how they were treated.
Everything.
Look at how some German Americans were treated during that time versus how those communities and groups have bounced back.
Well, the thing I was thinking about recently too, I don't know if you saw my post, but I've been sharing a bunch of this stuff from James Lindsay, and he had those different charts, and he talked about anti-racism as defined by the critical theorist versus liberalism. He means liberalism in the classical sense. And he was saying how a lot of the people say that liberalism failed, but I would argue they didn't really have it. Because if you think about it, it's like if you go straight from the end of things like segregation straight into affirmative action, things like that, like that's not liberalism. That's another form of control and power. And they were saying it failed, but again, it's like, it wasn't that it failed, it wasn't extended universally, that was the problem. Yeah. And even if it was, there still would be disparities for a time, but I think longer run it would have been a lot better.
Yeah. And the discrepancies aren't inherently negative. The difference is, because if they talk about diversity is our strength, and then they talk about the sameness, that's why I'm saying these words can't really mean what they mean. Like, they talk about art and things like that. Look at the diversity that's involved in art. If we were all the same, artistically wise, they wouldn't be art. Art is defined by the diversity, by the differences. If you just had a song with just one beat throughout the thing, it's a tone. It's not a song. But you have the diverse beats and words and tones and moves. It's a frustrating thing.
Yeah.
Like, you never have the singers photo thing. Their ancestors were enslaved by law. Two black women. Then today they're graduates of Howard Law School and a black male. Photo essay by Jenba Aduayom. Text by Nicole Henry Jones and Zandi Mhote. So yeah, and that's the thing. Like there was times when there were actually segregation, but now you actually get that other kind of segregation where it's like if you're Asian, you can be segregated against entering Harvard because you're overrepresented, but we're going to bring in black people. And then I saw some article sometime where it was like descendants of slaves, African Americans, black people were like, oh, we shouldn't have black people from sub-Saharan Africa coming in and taking in our affirmative action positions at the universities. Like, oh, there's too many actual Africans. Like, we need those are positions for African Americans. But at the same point, they actually have schools that are just black schools. They're saying this is a school for just black people. Imagine if Notre Dame was like, okay, no, we're just going to be Irish people now. This is we want 95% descendants of Irish people. How would that be treated versus having all those predominantly black, historically black schools? And I do understand people would say the history, like they were created because there was nobody else, there's nowhere else for these people to go. Yeah. But this whole idea that colleges, specifically when you talk about colleges, that's not something that was taken for granted. That was something that most people didn't go to college. Still today, most people don't go to college.
Yeah.
Despite what the United States of America actually does. I wonder, are there more black people who graduate from college in the United States of America than the entire sub-Saharan Africa? Probably not. Just from sheer numbers, I'd say no. But I'm sure it's pretty high.
You'd have to break it down to by like masters versus PhDs, and then I know med school it's very low. I saw this statistic in O'Reilly's book, but I think it was something like 2% of doctors are black or something. Like it's some very low number.
But definitely per capita, I think you'd have the highest number percentage-wise who's actually had post-secondary education would be blacks, Negroes in United States of America versus anywhere else in the world. I think you'd find that to be the highest number. And isn't black women like the highest undergraduate per percent per capita?
Yeah.
Although, like, what are they graduating in, which is in their question mark. Is there 2 more quotes here? I think we're at the end of the quotes here. We're also at about 2 hours. So let me just get the last quote in. Most Americans still don't know the full story of slavery. This is this history you didn't learn in school. Now that one I would agree. As I mentioned before, I think you asked people just basic numbers, how many people were brought over. I think if you gave them those 3 options that I mentioned, 10 million, 4 million, 1 million, and 400,000, I think most people would say the 4 million.
Yeah.
So if you don't know something that basic about it, I think that is not knowing the full story. What do you have to say about this quote?
Well, I mean, again, I think it's sort of that whole idea of like, oh, you haven't been taught this, and it's like, to an extent, yeah, I mean, there are certain details, like, for example, again, that book criticizing Howard Zinn, one of the things they talk about is how he does tell things from this point of Native Americans and, other groups, which again is important, but then the criticism of this is that he downplays some of the worser aspects, like, for example, I think it was both the Iroquois and the Huron who actually practiced cannibalism. Like there was a thing where, I think it might have been the Huron, I forget, but where if they defeated another tribe and there was a brave warrior that actually cut out their heart and eat it, like that was like, a thing. But the criticism is that people like Zinn downplay some of those things because he's trying to present them in a very positive light, and then he focuses strictly on the negative stuff with Europeans, which again should be talked about, but it's just then he doesn't get into how when Columbus landed, the natives who he encountered, they thought he was their savior because they were being brutalized by natives from another island, and that those natives would actually come and enslave natives and bring them back. So again, he doesn't get into some of that stuff, and I think it's this very sort of Manichaean like good versus evil struggle when it's like there's a lot of gray in both areas, and I think bigger picture wise we need to hear that whole story, whereas I think certain things like this, it's either things get overly romanticized or overly demonized. It's like you have to have both sides of that story, or it just doesn't. You're not really getting a full picture.
Yeah, and it also comes back to what we were talking about before. With saying where's the actual evidence? Where's the actual personal responsibility for it? Like, yeah, you're sent with the messaging. The messaging is out there to buy all these sugary treats. You walk by in the store. You have that money. The candy bars are there. But where does it come to the responsibility to say, I'm not going to take that candy bar? Where does that responsibility come to say where like the parent is like, no, why don't you buy like some corn or something else? It's something out there, an apple or something. Do something else versus actually the thing. When you take out the whole food desert thing. And there's a recent article, I think I recently interviewed, I don't know if you saw it, with the Hoover Institution, I think, Thomas Sowell talking about the charter schools and how just messed up that whole situation is, the fight against it.
Right.
There's a lot of pushback against it, and the next quote here says, "We are committing educational malpractice. Why slavery is mistaught and worse in American schools," by Nikita Stewart. Now, this sales situation, before this information about slavery, first of all, how available was this information? I do agree, we've mentioned that his story is somebody's story being told from one point of view.
Yeah.
When was this information literally there and they chose not to share it? If black parents have had this information, why aren't they telling the kids these things? If you have a situation now where you can have charter schools, you can have the school choice, and people can have more decision making on who's actually taught what and how, why isn't that a thing that people who say they're interested in the situations for black people or for their own communities, why aren't they supporting that instead of saying, oh, we need more compulsory this, we need more federal involvement in this, versus just agreeing with the choice and taking in that responsibility to message as much, get into situations where you can have as much personal like homeschooling and unschooling and have more parent-child interaction and say, maybe we should look about having more solid families. It doesn't have to be nuclear family, but have environments and places where you can have certain groups of parents stay home and still take care of kids and have that interaction versus having such high single parenthood rates where the parent's time is spent so much where they can't interact with the kid. Somebody else might be indoctrinating and programming that kid. Like this educational malpractice doesn't start at the schools. It starts in the home, from my estimation.
But it's interesting too because they've made the comparison a few times. If you look at most products, whether it be phones, computers, cars, etc., those things steadily improve over time, and people expect them to. But the school system has been basically the same for 200 years. You know, throwing in computers and stuff, and it's kind of ridiculous because for somebody like me, I'm thinking, you know, it's like you have things over Zoom. You can do all sorts of, you can do Zoom, all these other things now. Like the point somebody made with this whole thing with COVID now, what you could do is, you know, have 20-something-year-olds administer a class, have the teacher do Zoom from their home so they're not exposing themselves, but they're still teaching the kids, and then they're still assigning things. You know, the TA can help hand out papers, whatever. And, you know, it's like they're minimizing their own exposure, but the kids are still getting taught. Like, you could do things like that. Or, you know, of course, now there's things with homeschool co-ops. And it seems to me like there's a lot more options than we're pursuing, but it's just said that, like, oh, this is just how things are, don't question it. It's, you know.
Yeah. I mean, there's one positive thing. Maybe the same thing that's leading to these people involved with the 1619 project to have access to the information and then the platform to spread this are the same things that I think we're using right now to talk about and give our commentary and the great like advances that we're talking about with the education field and sharing of information, which I think is meant to be a more positive thing. I think finally at the end of this thing, they're talking about the 1619 project continues, and this is I think why it's important to have this conversation, because it's not just this article. It's the things that are being done based on this information that to me are a little more concerning than me just being like, oh, that's an article I'm not really going to read. Because, okay, here they have the 1619 podcast, an audio series of the Times observing their 400th anniversary and the beginning of American slavery, live at the Smithsonian. Watch highlights of the symposium about how history is defined and redefined, featuring historians, journalists, and policymakers. And with the Smithsonian thing, you saw that recent thing of the chart of whiteness, things that are considered to be whiteness. Was I shared that with people who are just not politically involved at all, and they were like, "That is a joke, right? Like that is not, you made this up." They didn't believe it was real. They're like, "This has to be a joke." It's in the Smithsonian, in the top African American museum in the United States of America. What's going on? Then they have reader response here. We ask you to share photographs and stories of your enslaved ancestors. The images and stories help paint a picture of too often erased American history. I think that's a positive thing. But again, those inventions being used to share these things were invented by white people. So I use might be tools and all these. Okay, reader responses. We asked you to how you learned about slavery in school. You told us about degrading role play, flawed lessons, and teachers who played down its horrors. I'm sure that happened. But then I'm sure there's also other ways to learn. And why didn't these people's parents teach them about slavery? So there's those kind of questions. Yeah. Race related, the 1619 project was conceived by Nicole Hannah-Jones. In this interview, she talks about the project and the reaction to it. Then sports. In the NBA, the very term owner has come under fire as players, most of whom are black, assert self-determination. Again, think on the NBA, most of whom are black. NBA is like 60% black or something.
Yeah, 65, I think.
How many Asian people are there? Should they have any Asian representation in there? Like, is that a thing? Should they have more Latinos because that's what reflects the country? Or is it just meritocracy where it just happens to be more black people are just better at basketball, have better bodies for it, have better backgrounds and culture that value it more, that you're going to have something that markets more towards black people? My big question with the NBA, what is your relationship with China? Because that thing, China to me is suspect. People who are dealing with China just openly and then one end they talk about this. Like I was thinking about this. Right now they're working in that bubble. The NBA players are playing in that bubble in Florida and whatnot, and they're talking about how, Trump shouldn't have this whole thing in Florida, this whole Republican National Convention because there's a spike. We were talking about different terms besides spike and surge. Soar is a new one that I've seen. The numbers are soaring. But you have this thing, okay, so the Republicans can't go there, but the NBA can have a bubble with all these people being driven to Florida in that same area and have a longer season and things like that. That's okay all of a sudden?
Yeah.
So you have this Black Lives Matter on the side or in people's shirts. Are you going to have a situation where the NBA is having a match, a game in Hong Kong with people wearing Black Lives Matter gear as Hong Kong has been taken over by the Chinese Communist Party? Is that going to be a situation where in the stands you have the rich, the people who are absurdly wealthy, who are kids of the people in the Communist Party, flying in there to watch these millionaire black basketball players talk about how they're so oppressed by their country, yet they're actually, it's so twisted in my mind, that one. Last thing here, or behind the scenes of 1619, since January, the Times magazine has been working on an issue to mark the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved people arriving in America. So that's it from this. And it says here, for teachers looking for ways to use this issue in your classroom, you can find curriculums, guides, and activities for students developed by the Pulitzer Prize Center at pulitzercenter.org, 1619, and it's all free.
Yeah.
So I think with this in mind here, this is what you mentioned, like this is being used in schools.
Yeah.
Supposedly in such a racist country, you have an organization as influential, however influential it is, as the Pulitzer Prize, however influential the New York Times, one of the predominant newspapers for a long time still is giving these people a platform to say this, yet America is still so racist?
Yeah.
What is the definition of these things? This whole thing of going to school. Now, I'll ask you, right? So, you had certain things you wanted to actually discuss, and we kind of just loosely talked about how this would go. I didn't know going to all the different 10 things. Do you think the other parts, did you address some of the points that you had? Should we go, because I think the teaching part, how it's being used is a key part, and the critiques specifically towards the actual content is a key part of this. Do you think we should continue that now, or do it in a separate one?
Get more into the technical points another time, just because it's, we're at 2.5 hours. I was probably going to take too long. So.
Because we can leave it off here with just the intro to the actual project and our general thoughts around it.
I think it's good, the general thoughts and some things tied in, yes.
Okay. So maybe the next one we go the direct critique, because give a little intro of the kind of the critique that you specifically had posted on or you wanted to discuss. Just give a teaser of what the next one would be about.
So it's written by Sol Magnus, who he works for American Institute for Economic Research. I have him as a friend on Facebook. I comment on his stuff sometimes. He's an economic historian, and he wrote this because he was one of the people who read this and realized there was a lot of false information. So he said, let me tackle this issue by issue and sort of explain where they're wrong. Now, what's interesting is that there are a few... what he did was he was commenting on the pushback from the mainstream historians who criticize it. He basically said, are these historians right? And then, he said there was one area where the project was actually more right than his critics, and that has to do with Lincoln and colonization, which is an area Magnus himself actually did a lot of research in. So there are things like that, but then he said a lot of the other things, it's bad methodology. I'll get into it next time, but they come up with a way of calculating share of cotton in the economy, which is way higher than it was, but they basically invent their own methodology to do that. There's, of course, the whole role of the American Revolution about how they argue it was to preserve this, but of course his argument is no, Britain itself didn't abolish slavery until I think 1830s. So there's just a lot of things that, it's omitted, cherry-picked. Like I say, some of the methodology is a bit flawed. He cites several studies from outside, including from Harvard. So, his critique, as far as I can tell, is pretty solid. But, he's saying, obviously, we should talk about these things, but we should do it correct and honestly, not distort information for the sake of ideology.
Okay. So yeah, so I think that's a good teaser, and probably leave it off here, at least for this recording. We might actually even break this up into 2 parts. There might be a way to do the initial start and then. I mean, even this one we've just recorded. I'll see how it is when it actually goes to editing. Yeah, but for those of you who've been listening, thank you a lot for listening. And if you want, go and read the material. Go and read how many pages was it? It was like 10 essays with about 100 pages.
Yeah, about that.
And it's there at the New York Times, so you can find the entire project there. And as I mentioned, if you found that anything we've said is just blatantly wrong or completely misguided, or you think there's certain information that from the things that we've mentioned would change our mind, please let us know in the comment section, and we'll try to interact and check that out. But as we mentioned, I shall record another part where we go more directly into the critique of the point-to-point things here with Stephen. Thank you very much, Stephen, for taking your 2.5 hours out of your time to do this. Anything else to say to the people out there listening?
No, that's it. It's good, and I look forward to the next one.
Okay. Goodbye.